Close your eyes for a moment and breathe deeply. Let the weight of the day dissolve from your shoulders like snow melting in spring sunshine. Tonight, we're going to embark on a gentle journey through time, not to the past we know with all its certainties and established facts, but to pasts that never were, worlds that might have existed if the great turning points of history had pivoted in different directions, if crucial decisions had been made differently, if chance had favored other outcomes. The question we'll explore together, slowly and without any sense of urgency or alarm, is this: what would have happened if World War II had ended differently? We'll approach this not with the excitement of adventure stories or the tension of military history, but with the quiet contemplation of someone sitting by a fireplace on a winter evening, watching flames dance and wondering about the stories they might tell if they could speak. In our world, the war that consumed the globe from 1939 to 1945 ended with Allied victory. The forces of Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and their allies emerged triumphant from the greatest conflict in human history. Nazi Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, as Soviet forces fought through the streets of Berlin, while American and British armies closed in from the west. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, after atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the Pacific War to its conclusion and ushering in the nuclear age. The world, scarred by years of unprecedented destruction, and exhausted by the enormous human and material costs of global warfare, began the long, difficult process of healing, rebuilding, and reimagining what human civilization might become in the aftermath of such devastating conflict. Cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, millions of people had been displaced from their homes, and entire nations had to be reconstructed from the ground up. But tonight, we'll drift into what historians call alternative history or counterfactual history. This is not about changing the past, which is of course impossible, but about understanding how fragile and contingent were the events that shaped our world. It's about recognizing how small moments, different decisions, a battle won instead of lost, a leader making a different choice at a crucial moment, even a weather pattern shifting in an unexpected direction, can reshape the destiny of entire civilizations and alter the course of human development for generations. Think of history as a great river with countless tributaries flowing into it from every direction. At every confluence where these streams meet, the water could have taken a different course, flowing toward different destinations, carving different channels through the landscape of human experience. Most of the time, we follow the main channel of what actually happened, the events we read about in history books, but tonight we'll explore some of those other streams, those alternative pathways that existed as real possibilities before the flow of events foreclosed them forever. Picture yourself standing at a crossroads on a quiet country lane at twilight, when the last light of day is fading and the first stars are beginning to appear. You can see several paths stretching into the distance, each leading through different landscapes toward different destinations. Some paths wind through dark forests where the outcome is uncertain and potentially dangerous. Others cross sunny meadows where the journey seems pleasant and hopeful. Still others follow mountain ridges or riverside trails, each offering its own challenges and rewards. In reality, history walked down one particular path at each of these crucial crossroads, but tonight, we'll imagine what travelers might have found if they had chosen differently at those crucial moments when the future hung in the balance, and multiple outcomes seemed equally possible. Alternative history is like a gentle meditation on human possibility and the fundamental nature of historical change. It reminds us that nothing in human affairs is truly inevitable, that every outcome we now take for granted once hung in the balance, as uncertain and fragile as morning dew on grass that might evaporate with the first touch of sunshine or survive to nourish new growth. The world we inhabit today, with all its complexities and contradictions, its achievements and failures, its moments of beauty and periods of darkness, emerged from millions upon millions of small choices and chance events, each one capable of nudging the great stream of history in slightly different directions that could have led to dramatically different outcomes. The practice of imagining alternative histories goes back centuries, though it has become more sophisticated and systematic in recent decades. Historians have always wondered what if about crucial moments in human development. What if Cleopatra's nose had been shorter, and she had been less beautiful, altering her relationship with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony? What if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo and continued his conquests across Europe? What if Abraham Lincoln had not gone to Ford's Theater that April evening in 1865 and had lived to oversee Reconstruction? These questions help us understand that history is not a predetermined script being followed by actors who have no choice in their roles, but rather an ongoing improvisation by billions of human actors, each making decisions based on incomplete information, personal values, and circumstances that could have been different. Every major historical outcome resulted from countless individual choices that could have gone another way. Imagine, if you will, a vast cosmic library where each book tells the story of a different possible world, a different path that human civilization might have taken. The library is infinite, containing every possible variation of human history, from worlds very similar to ours with only minor differences, to worlds so different that we would barely recognize them as human at all. Tonight, we'll open just a few of these books, reading slowly and thoughtfully, letting their stories wash over us like gentle waves on a peaceful shore. We're not seeking excitement or drama, not looking for heroes and villains or clear moral lessons, but rather understanding and reflection about the nature of human choices and their far-reaching consequences. The beauty of this exploration lies not so much in the specific destinations we'll visit, though each has its own fascination, but in the journey itself, in the process of imagination and reflection that helps us understand both the past that was and the future that might be. As we drift through these alternative worlds like clouds across an evening sky, we'll discover that certain aspects of human nature remain remarkably constant even as political circumstances and social conditions change dramatically. People still wake up each morning to greet the sunrise, still share meals with loved ones around familiar tables, still find moments of joy and wonder in the midst of whatever challenges they face, regardless of which political systems govern them, which flags fly over their cities, or which languages dominate the airwaves. The fundamental human experiences of love, loss, hope, fear, creativity, and connection persist across all possible timelines. In each alternative world we visit, we'll observe how the great currents of historical change shape, but do not entirely determine the intimate details of individual lives. We'll see how people adapt to circumstances beyond their control, how they find ways to maintain their humanity and dignity even under the most challenging conditions, how the bonds of family and friendship and community prove stronger than the political systems that attempt to control them. So settle back now. Let your breathing slow and deepen like someone preparing for a peaceful night's sleep. Let your mind become like a calm lake at sunset, its surface perfectly still and ready to reflect whatever images we encounter on our journey. There's no need to judge these alternative worlds we'll visit, no need to prefer one over another, or to become agitated by the darker possibilities we'll explore. We're simply wandering through the infinite garden of human possibility, observing, wondering, imagining what might have been. The exercise of alternative history serves several important purposes beyond mere curiosity or entertainment. It helps us appreciate the particular path that history actually took, understanding that the freedoms we enjoy, the prosperity we may take for granted, and the opportunities we have were not inevitable gifts of fate but hard-won achievements that could easily have been lost or never gained at all. It also helps us understand that the future, like the past, contains multiple possibilities, and that our choices today, both individual and collective, will help determine which of those possibilities becomes reality for future generations. Just as the people of the 1940 could not foresee the exact consequences of their decisions, we cannot predict with certainty how our current choices will shape the world our children and grandchildren will inherit. Alternative history also cultivates intellectual humility by reminding us how much depends on factors beyond human control, whether patterns that affect military campaigns, diseases that strike down key leaders at crucial moments, technological breakthroughs that occur in one laboratory rather than another, chance encounters that lead to pivotal friendships or enmities. This doesn't diminish the importance of human agency and moral choice, but it places them in proper context. As we prepare to begin our exploration of specific alternative timelines, remember that each scenario we'll visit was a real possibility at the time when crucial decisions were being made. The leaders and peoples of the 1940 could not see the future any more clearly than we can see ours today. They made choices based on incomplete information, uncertain circumstances, and hopes and fears that seemed reasonable given what they knew at the time. The first scenario we'll explore together is perhaps the most sobering and difficult to contemplate, yet we'll approach it with the same gentle curiosity and emotional equanimity that we bring to all our destinations tonight. What if the Nazi regime, despite all its moral failings and strategic errors, had somehow achieved the military and political victory it desperately sought? What if Hitler's mad dream of a 1,000-year Reich had somehow become reality, at least temporarily? This is not a question we ask lightly or with any sense of sympathy for Nazi ideology, which was fundamentally evil in its premises and horrific in its implementation. Rather, we ask it precisely because understanding how close the world came to such a fate helps us appreciate the tremendous value of what was actually achieved through the courage, sacrifice, and determination of those who fought against fascism and totalitarianism. The Nazi victory scenario forces us to confront difficult questions about the nature of political power, the resilience of human values under extreme pressure, and the ways in which ordinary people might have adapted to or resisted a world organized according to principles we find morally repugnant. It reminds us that the triumph of democracy and human rights was not inevitable, but depended on specific choices made by millions of individuals who could have chosen differently. Take a slow, deep breath now. Let your mind prepare for this difficult but important exploration, and let us begin this journey together through the landscapes of possibility that stretch out before us like an infinite horizon under the stars. Remember that we are exploring these alternatives not to glorify or condemn, but to understand, and through understanding, to better appreciate both the world we have inherited and the choices we face in shaping the world we will leave behind. Chapter 2. Scenario 1: Nazi Germany wins the war. Breathe slowly and deeply, letting your imagination drift like morning fog across a landscape that never was, yet could have been under different circumstances. We find ourselves in 1950 in this alternative timeline, 5 long years after a very different ending to the world's greatest and most destructive conflict. The swastika now flies over London's Westminster, over Paris's Eiffel Tower, over Warsaw's painstakingly reconstructed squares. The 1,000-year Reich that Hitler promised with such fanatical conviction has become a grim reality, at least for now, and Europe has been transformed according to National Socialist vision in ways both subtle and profound. Picture this world emerging slowly and deliberately, like a photograph developing in a darkroom solution. Berlin has become far more than Germany's political and cultural capital. It has evolved into the administrative nerve center of a continental empire stretching from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the Ural Mountains of Russia, from the Arctic fjords of Norway to the warm Mediterranean coasts of Spain and Italy. The city itself has been rebuilt according to Hitler's grandiose architectural dreams, dreams that seemed megamaniacal during the war, but have now been realized with typical German efficiency and attention to detail. Massive stone buildings rise from carefully planned boulevards, structures designed not just to house government offices, but to dwarf individual human beings psychologically, reminding them constantly and unmistakably of their place in the grand hierarchy of the Reich. The famous Brandenburg Gate no longer stands as a symbol of German unity and democratic aspiration, but as the western entrance to a vast imperial domain where administrative decisions made in air-conditioned offices affect the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people across multiple time zones. Unter den Linden has been widened into a processional avenue where military parades and party rallies occur with clockwork regularity, their choreographed precision, designed to demonstrate the power and permanence of the new order. The Reichstag, completely rebuilt and vastly expanded from its pre-war proportions, now houses not just German legislators but administrators who govern territories spanning continents and encompassing dozens of formerly independent peoples, each with their own languages, traditions, and historical grievances that must be carefully managed or systematically suppressed. In this imagined world, the German language has begun its inexorable spread across the European continent, like water finding its natural level, seeping into every corner of public life through a combination of official policy and practical necessity. Children in occupied France recite their morning lessons in carefully pronounced German, their young voices stumbling over unfamiliar sounds while their teachers, many of whom remember different times, guide them through grammar exercises and vocabulary drills that gradually replace their native linguistic instincts. Polish students in Krakow and Warsaw learn German poetry by heart, memorizing verses that celebrate German cultural achievements while their own rich literary heritage gradually disappears from official curricula, preserved only in whispered conversations and hidden family traditions. Italian merchants in Venice and Florence conduct their increasingly important business transactions in the language of their conquerors, finding that fluency in German opens commercial doors that remain firmly closed to those who cling stubbornly to local dialects and regional preferences. The process is not entirely imposed by brute force, though the threat of force certainly underlies every aspect of the linguistic transformation. German has simply become the language of opportunity, advancement, and access to the best jobs and highest positions throughout the continental empire. Parents throughout occupied Europe, whatever their private feelings about the occupation and its long-term implications, pragmatically ensure that their children learn German fluently because they want their children to have futures, to be able to participate in the new economic and social order rather than being relegated to permanent second-class status. Walk with me now down the transformed streets of this alternative London, where the Thames still flows with its ancient tidal rhythms, but the great city has been subtly yet unmistakably changed by 5 years of efficient German administration. The famous red telephone boxes remain as nostalgic symbols of British tradition, but they now bear German inscriptions alongside the English text, and the conversations conducted within them are increasingly monitored by sophisticated surveillance systems that German engineers have installed throughout the urban infrastructure. The iconic double-decker buses continue to follow their familiar routes through streets that Londoners have known for generations, but German officers and administrators often occupy the best seats, their presence serving as a constant reminder of the new political reality. The buses themselves display schedules and route information in both languages, with German text slightly larger and more prominently placed, a subtle but significant indication of linguistic hierarchy. Westminster Abbey still stands as a monument to centuries of British history and religious tradition, its ancient stones bearing witness to the coronations of kings and queens, the weddings of princes and princesses, the funeral services of national heroes. But now, it hosts ceremonies that carefully blend traditional Anglican rituals with Nazi political symbolism, creating hybrid events that satisfy both the occupying authorities' need for legitimacy and the occupied population's desire to maintain some connection with their cultural heritage. The coronation chair remains in its traditional place, but it's unclear when or whether it will ever again seat a British monarch. The Houses of Parliament continue to meet in their historic chambers, but as a subordinate legislature dealing primarily with local British affairs, while all major policy decisions affecting the British Isles are made by German authorities in consultation with Berlin. The British Museum presents a particularly complex and troubling example of cultural adaptation under occupation. The Great Collection remains largely intact, a testament to centuries of British exploration, scholarship, and sometimes problematic acquisition of artifacts from around the world. But the interpretation of these artifacts has been systematically changed to reflect Nazi racial theories and historical perspectives. Egyptian mummies are displayed with accompanying commentary that emphasizes supposed Aryan influences on ancient civilizations, despite the complete lack of credible evidence for such claims. Greek sculptures are presented as examples of Nordic racial superiority, with detailed explanations of how these masterpieces demonstrate the artistic and cultural achievements that can only be produced by racially pure peoples. The Elgin marbles are described as having been rescued from Mediterranean decadence and preserved through Germanic efficiency and cultural sensitivity. In Hyde Park, the famous Speaker's Corner still exists as a symbol of British free speech traditions, but speakers must now register their topics in advance with German authorities, and certain subjects are explicitly forbidden under regulations that are enforced with typical German thoroughness. People still gather on Sunday afternoons to hear debates and discussions, but the conversations are more muted, more careful, more aware of invisible boundaries that must not be crossed if speakers want to avoid unpleasant consequences. The park itself is maintained according to rigorous German standards of order and cleanliness, with precise geometric flower beds replacing the more casual English garden style that previously characterized London's green spaces. Every blade of grass seems perfectly manicured, every pathway swept clean of debris, every bench positioned according to some master plan that prioritizes efficiency over the comfortable randomness that made Hyde Park feel distinctly British. The pubs of London remain open and continue to serve as social centers for British working-class life, but the atmosphere within these establishments has changed in ways both subtle and significant. German officers and administrators drink alongside British civilians who have learned to moderate their conversations and avoid topics that might attract unwelcome official attention. The traditional British Reserve has deepened into something more cautious and watchful. Conversations proceed along carefully established channels, avoiding the dangerous currents of politics or nostalgia for different times. People discuss weather and local sports, family news and neighborhood gossip, anything that seems safely neutral and unlikely to be interpreted as criticism of the new order or longing for the old one. Picture now the schools throughout this alternative Europe, where young minds are being systematically shaped according to carefully developed Nazi educational philosophy. Classrooms display maps showing the Greater German Reich, stretching across continents, with different colors indicating the precise hierarchy of peoples within the empire and their respective roles in the new order. Children learn that Aryans represent the pinnacle of human evolutionary development, that other races exist primarily to serve German leadership and contribute to German cultural and economic objectives, that the recent war was a necessary intervention to bring order to a chaotic world that had been mismanaged by inferior peoples and corrupt democratic politicians. The textbooks tell carefully edited and systematically distorted versions of European history, emphasizing German contributions to science, philosophy, art, and literature, while minimizing or completely eliminating the achievements of other peoples and nations. Students learn about great German composers like Bach, Beethoven, and Wagner, but hear nothing about Jewish musicians like Mendelssohn who have been erased from the official cultural record. They study German philosophers like Kant, Hegel, and Nietzsche, but learn nothing about French, British, or Italian thinkers who challenged German intellectual supremacy or offered alternative visions of human social and political development. Even when non-German achievements cannot be completely ignored, they are reinterpreted through a racial lens that credits German blood or Germanic influences for whatever value they might possess. Mathematics and science education proceed relatively normally in most technical respects, since objective knowledge about the natural world is essential for maintaining industrial productivity and military superiority. But even scientific education is systematically colored by racial ideology, with biology classes teaching that human racial differences are not merely superficial but scientifically measurable and socially significant in ways that justify the political hierarchy of the Reich. Students learn about German scientific achievements and technological innovations, while hearing little about international collaboration or foreign contributions to scientific progress. The international scientific community that existed before the war, with its networks of cooperation and knowledge sharing across national boundaries, has been replaced by a German-dominated system that treats scientific knowledge as a national resource to be carefully controlled and strategically deployed. Physical education receives special emphasis throughout the Nazi educational system, with students participating in programs designed to build not just individual fitness and athletic ability, but collective discipline and unquestioning acceptance of social hierarchy. Boys train in activities that prepare them for potential military service, developing the physical strength, mental toughness, and group solidarity that the regime considers essential for maintaining its continental empire. Girls participate in programs that prepare them for their designated roles as wives and mothers, learning domestic skills and racial ideology that will enable them to raise the next generation of loyal citizens. Physical fitness is emphasized for girls as well as boys, but within the framework of preparing them to bear healthy children who will contribute to the biological strength of the German race. Sports throughout the educational system become exercises in demonstrating racial superiority, rather than simple competitions or recreational activities. Athletic achievements by German students are celebrated as evidence of Aryan physical capabilities, while failures or limitations are explained as temporary setbacks that can be overcome through proper training and ideological commitment. The museums and cultural institutions of Europe tell entirely new stories in this imagined world, stories that have been carefully crafted to support Nazi interpretations of human development and European cultural history. The Louvre in Paris, once home to artistic treasures representing the full spectrum of human creativity across cultures and centuries, now displays only art that conforms to Nazi aesthetic principles and supports their vision of cultural hierarchy. Renaissance paintings remain on prominent display, but with accompanying interpretative materials that emphasize the supposed Germanic ancestry of Italian artists or point to alleged Aryan racial characteristics in the painted subjects. Medieval art is presented as evidence of early German cultural influence spreading throughout Europe, even before political unification made such influence explicit and systematic. Modern art, particularly abstract and expressionist works that the Nazis condemned as degenerate, has disappeared entirely from public view. These pieces have been removed to storage facilities or simply destroyed, condemned as harmful to social order and dangerous to the mental health of viewers, who might be confused or corrupted by exposure to non-representational artistic expressions. The Sistine Chapel in Rome continues to attract visitors, but Michelangelo's masterpieces are now interpreted according to Nazi art theory that emphasizes their supposed reflection of Germanic aesthetic values and Nordic artistic sensibilities. Even when Italian origins cannot be denied, the commentary suggests that the greatest Italian achievements occurred when Italian artists were most influenced by Germanic cultural traditions. The great libraries of Europe continue to function as centers of learning and research, but their collections have been systematically purged of books that contradict Nazi ideology or challenge German political and cultural authority. Works by Jewish authors, communist writers, liberal philosophers, and international humanists have been removed from the shelves and often burned in public ceremonies designed to demonstrate the regime's commitment to ideological purity. What remains is carefully organized according to racial and political categories, with the most prominent shelf space reserved for German authors and Nazi-approved international writers. Literature sections emphasize works that support themes of racial consciousness, national loyalty, and hierarchical social organization, while books that celebrate individual freedom, democratic values, or universal human rights have been eliminated entirely. In the quiet corners and hidden spaces of this imagined Europe, however, resistance persists like wildflowers growing through cracks in concrete pavements. In the rugged mountains of Yugoslavia, small groups of partisans continue to maintain their opposition to German rule, using their intimate knowledge of local terrain and their networks of family and community support to evade capture, while conducting carefully planned sabotage operations against transportation and communication infrastructure. These resistance fighters move through forests and mountain passes that have sheltered rebels and freedom fighters for centuries, carrying on traditions of independence and self-determination that predate the current political crisis by generations. They operate radio equipment hidden in caves and abandoned buildings, maintaining contact with the outside world and coordinating their activities with similar groups in other regions. In the ancient forests of Poland, underground schools meet in secret locations to teach Polish history, literature, and language to children, who officially receive only German versions of these subjects in their regular classrooms. Teachers who remember Poland's brief period of interwar independence risk their lives and freedom to preserve knowledge of Polish heroes, Polish cultural achievements, and Polish contributions to European civilization. These clandestine educators understand that they are keeping alive not just information and cultural traditions, but the very possibility of a different future. They teach children songs in Polish, stories about Polish kings and queens, poems by Polish writers who celebrated themes of freedom and national identity that are now officially forbidden but spiritually essential. Beneath the streets of Paris, in sewers and abandoned metro stations that most people have forgotten, resistance networks maintain printing presses that produce leaflets and underground newspapers, reminding readers of democratic values and human rights principles that seem to have vanished from official discourse, but continue to live in human hearts and minds. These publications are distributed through elaborate networks of sympathizers who understand that they are risking not just their own safety, but the welfare of their families and friends. Yet they continue this dangerous work because they believe that truth and freedom are more valuable than personal security, that some principles are worth defending even when the odds seem impossible, and the consequences of discovery are severe. In London's bombed-out buildings and forgotten underground stations, small groups of British patriots maintain illegal radio equipment capable of receiving broadcasts from free British forces operating from Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth territories beyond German reach. They share news about continuing resistance efforts, international diplomatic developments, and evidence that the German Empire may not be as permanent or invulnerable as its propaganda claims. These activities require tremendous personal courage because the penalties for discovery are immediate and severe. German security forces, aided by local collaborators who have chosen cooperation over resistance, maintain extensive surveillance networks designed to identify and eliminate opposition movements before they can become organized or effective. Yet the resistance persists because some people find it psychologically and morally impossible to live without hope, impossible to accept that German rule represents the permanent future of European civilization. They understand that their individual acts of defiance may seem insignificant against the massive power of the Reich, but they also understand that historical change often begins with small acts of courage that inspire others to similar bravery. Consider now the daily life of ordinary people trying to survive and maintain some semblance of normal existence under these extraordinary and challenging circumstances. A French baker in Lyon still rises before dawn to prepare bread for his neighborhood customers. But now, he must follow detailed German regulations about ingredients, pricing, distribution, and customer service that reflect the regime's obsession with control and efficiency. His ovens still warm the morning air with the familiar smells of baking bread that have characterized French neighborhoods for centuries, and neighbors still gather at his shop to purchase their daily requirements. But conversations happen in whispers, rather than the animated discussions that once characterized French social life. Certain topics are simply never mentioned aloud. The resistance, the old government, hopes for liberation, criticism of German policies, or nostalgia for the France that existed before the occupation. The baker has learned enough German to communicate with German officials, who conduct regular inspections of his shop to ensure compliance with occupation regulations. He treats German customers and officials with careful politeness, avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as either excessive friendliness that could make him suspect among his French neighbors, or subtle hostility that could bring unwelcome attention from the authorities. His wife manages their household according to complex rationing systems that prioritize German needs over local preferences and traditional French dietary customs. She has become expert at creating nutritious and reasonably tasty meals from limited ingredients, at preserving food to last through unpredictable shortages, and at maintaining family traditions and cultural customs despite the restrictions and pressures that surround them. She teaches their children to be respectful toward German authorities, while privately instilling French cultural values and maintaining family connections to French history and tradition. This delicate balancing act requires constant attention and considerable psychological strength, as she must prepare her children to succeed in the new order while hoping that someday they will be able to reclaim their French identity more openly. A Polish teacher in Krakow continues to work with students in classrooms that bear little resemblance to the schools where she was educated, but she has found subtle ways to honor her professional calling, despite the political constraints that govern her daily activities. Officially, She teaches curricula designed in Berlin rather than Warsaw, presenting German interpretations of geography, history, and literature rather than Polish perspectives on these subjects. She teaches German geography, where Polish mountains and rivers once had Polish names, leading students through lessons about the Greater German Reich, where Poland appears only as a subordinate administrative region rather than an independent nation with its own cultural and political identity. She guides students through German poetry and literature, where Polish verses once celebrated Polish heroes, Polish achievements, and Polish hopes for freedom and self-determination. Yet in the way she speaks, in the examples she chooses to illustrate abstract concepts, in the tone of her voice when she discusses certain topics, she finds ways to convey deeper truths alongside the official lessons. During lunch breaks and after-school periods, when German supervisors are not present to monitor every interaction, she speaks quietly with individual students about Polish history and culture, sharing knowledge that is no longer officially permitted but which she considers essential for maintaining Polish identity and hope. She risks her career, her freedom, and potentially her life with these private conversations, but she believes that education means more than simply transmitting approved information. She sees herself as a guardian of Polish cultural continuity, responsible for ensuring that Polish traditions and values survive even under the most difficult circumstances. Her husband works in a factory that once produced goods for Polish consumers, but now manufactures components and finished products that serve German economic and military purposes throughout the Continental Empire. He operates machinery according to German technical specifications, follows German industrial procedures, and meets German production quotas that often seem unrealistic but must somehow be achieved. He has learned German technical vocabulary necessary for understanding work orders and safety procedures, has adapted to German industrial methods that emphasize efficiency and precision over the more relaxed approaches that characterized Polish factories in earlier times, and has accepted German supervisors whose authority cannot be challenged or questioned. Yet during breaks and informal moments, he maintains Polish friendships with fellow workers who share his background and his quiet hopes for a different future. They speak Polish together when they can do so without attracting attention, share Polish jokes and stories that help them maintain psychological connections to their cultural heritage, and observe Polish holidays and family traditions in private celebrations that strengthen community bonds. He contributes what he can to underground networks that provide assistance to families of political prisoners, that maintain connections with Polish military units still operating in exile beyond German control, and that preserve information and resources that might be useful if circumstances ever change in ways that make active resistance possible or effective. An Italian merchant in Venice continues to conduct import and export business through the ancient port city that has connected Europe with the broader world for over 1,000 years. But his commercial activities now operate within German networks and serve German economic priorities, rather than the international trading relationships that made Venice wealthy and cosmopolitan. He has learned to read and speak German well enough to handle commercial documents, negotiate with German trading companies, and comply with the complex German banking and currency regulations that now govern all significant commercial activities throughout the occupied territories. His office walls display maps showing trade routes that connect German-controlled ports throughout Europe, North Africa, and potentially beyond. The goods flowing through his warehouses have changed dramatically to reflect new political and economic realities. He imports raw materials needed for German industrial production and exports finished products manufactured in German factories to markets throughout the German sphere of influence. Traditional Mediterranean trading networks that connected Venice with North Africa, the Middle East, and the Eastern Mediterranean, have been reorganized to serve German strategic and economic objectives. Yet in his personal life, he maintains Italian cultural traditions and family relationships that provide continuity with Venice's long history as an independent commercial republic. He speaks Italian with his family, participates in Italian religious and social customs that continue despite political changes, and quietly supports Italian cultural institutions that preserve Venetian artistic and intellectual traditions. He provides employment for Italian workers who might otherwise face economic hardship under the occupation, and he contributes discreetly to networks that assist Italian political exiles and refugees who have fled to areas beyond German control. His commercial connections sometimes allow him to facilitate communications between separated Italian families, or to provide assistance for Italians seeking to escape German-controlled territory. The technology of this alternative world develops along paths that reflect German priorities, German values, and German strategic objectives, rather than the international scientific cooperation and market-driven innovation that characterized technological development before the war. Research and development throughout German-controlled Europe focuses heavily on military applications, industrial efficiency, and methods of social control, rather than consumer convenience or improvements in quality of life for ordinary people. German scientists and engineers work on increasingly sophisticated rocket technology, building on the V-2 missiles that contributed to German military success, and developing space-capable vehicles decades before such achievements occurred in our timeline. By 1955, German aircraft regularly crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a matter of hours rather than days, demonstrating technological capabilities that reinforce German claims to global leadership and cultural superiority. Television technology advances with remarkable speed, but primarily as a medium for propaganda distribution and population surveillance, rather than entertainment and education. German television networks broadcast throughout occupied Europe, carrying carefully produced programming that reinforces Nazi ideology, while providing enough information and diversion to maintain popular acquiescence to the new order. These broadcasts reach audiences from London to Moscow, from Oslo to Rome, creating shared experiences and common reference points that gradually erode local cultural traditions and replace them with German alternatives. Television becomes a powerful tool for cultural homogenization, slowly but systematically undermining the linguistic and cultural diversity that once characterized European civilization. Radio networks span the continental empire with impressive technical sophistication, carrying German-language broadcasts that provide news, music, and educational programming designed to create European-wide acceptance of German political leadership and cultural hegemony. Local radio stations continue to operate throughout the occupied territories, but their programming must conform to strict guidelines established in Berlin, and their content is regularly monitored for ideological compliance and potential subversive messages. The development of computer technology, which was just beginning to emerge from military research programs during the war, proceeds more slowly in this alternative timeline because German victory reduces the immediate urgency of technological innovation for military purposes. The international community of scientists and engineers who created early computer technology in our timeline has been disrupted by Nazi racial policies, the persecution and emigration of Jewish scientists, and restrictions on international scientific collaboration. Many of the brilliant minds who might have contributed to rapid computer development have been killed, driven into exile, or forbidden from participating in advanced research programs because of their ethnic backgrounds or political beliefs. The loss of intellectual diversity and international cooperation, significantly slows the pace of innovation in fields that require creative thinking and interdisciplinary collaboration. Nuclear technology proceeds along different and potentially more dangerous paths as well. Without the intense pressure of wartime competition with American atomic research, German nuclear physics develops more slowly but with different ultimate applications. German scientists focus more heavily on nuclear reactors for industrial power generation and less on nuclear weapons development, since conventional military superiority seems sufficient for maintaining German dominance throughout their continental empire. However, the exclusive German control of nuclear technology creates long-term strategic imbalances that could have unpredictable consequences for global security. Without the mutual deterrence that characterized the Cold War in our timeline, nuclear weapons in this alternative world serve as instruments of German hegemony, rather than tools for maintaining international stability through balance of power. Let your mind drift now to the year 1960 in this imagined world, 15 years after the alternative German victory that reshaped European civilization. An entire generation has grown to adulthood under Nazi rule. Young people who have only dim childhood memories of life before German occupation, or who were born into the new order and know no other way of organizing human society. For many young Germans, the Continental Empire seems natural, permanent, and beneficial not just for Germany but for all European peoples. They have been educated in schools that presented German cultural superiority as established scientific fact, German political leadership as obviously beneficial for maintaining order and prosperity, and the recent war as a necessary intervention to prevent European chaos and economic collapse. These young people have grown up speaking German as the obvious and natural language of European civilization, thinking of Berlin as the undisputed center of European culture, politics, and economic activity, and assuming that European integration under German leadership represents the culmination of centuries of historical development toward greater efficiency, prosperity, and social harmony. Yet even the most sophisticated and comprehensive propaganda systems cannot completely eliminate human diversity of thought and feeling, human curiosity about alternatives, or human longing for authenticity and freedom. In quiet corners of this imagined Europe, young people still ask questions that challenge official answers and express doubts about the explanations they receive for why things are organized as they are. Children still notice inconsistencies between what they are taught in school and what they observe in their daily lives. They wonder why certain books are forbidden, why some topics cannot be discussed openly, why their grandparents sometimes become sad or angry when certain subjects are mentioned, why people hash. Chapter 3. Scenario 2. Japan maintains its empire. Breathe deeply and let your mind drift eastward, across vast oceans to imagine a different Pacific world. In this gentle alternative, the rising sun never set on Japanese dreams of Asian unity. Picture this scenario unfolding like morning mist over rice fields, beautiful and complex in its implications. It's 1950 in this imagined timeline. The greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere has become reality, stretching from the frozen shores of Manchuria to the tropical islands of Indonesia, from the mountains of Korea to the beaches of the Philippines. This is not conquest in the Western sense, but something more subtle, the gradual flowering of Pan-Asian consciousness under Japanese guidance. Tokyo in this alternative world gleams like a jewel in the morning sun. Ancient wooden temples stand harmoniously alongside modern steel and glass towers. The city has evolved beyond being merely Japan's capital. It has become the beating heart of an Asian empire that encompasses half the globe. Cherry blossoms still bloom in carefully tended parks, but now they symbolize not just Japanese beauty, but Asian renewal. Picture the bullet trains of this timeline, invented a decade earlier than in our world. They race across vast distances like silver arrows, connecting Tokyo to Seoul in 3 hours, to Shanghai in 6, to Singapore in 18. These trains carry more than passengers. They carry ideas, cultures, and dreams between ancient civilizations now linked in political unity. In Shanghai, the Bund along the Huangpu River presents a fascinating mixture of architectural styles. Art Deco buildings from the city's international period stand alongside new structures that blend Chinese classical motifs with Japanese design principles. The river bustles with ships bearing the rising sun flag, but their crews speak a dozen different languages. Their cargo represents the wealth of half a continent. Walk through the streets of this alternative Shanghai and notice how cultures have begun to weave together in unexpected ways. Chinese merchants work alongside Japanese administrators, conducting business in a patois that mixes languages like ingredients in a complex dish. Traditional Chinese tea houses serve varieties imported from Japan, Ceylon, and Java. The city's famous neon signs glow in multiple scripts: Chinese characters, Japanese hiragana and katakana, and increasingly, English for international visitors. The morning sun rises over Manila in this timeline to illuminate a city where Spanish colonial architecture houses Japanese colonial administrators. Filipino children walk to schools where they learn Japanese characters alongside their native script, where they study Asian history from a Japanese perspective, where they practice calligraphy that honors both local and imperial traditions. But what makes this alternative different from European-style conquest is the way Japanese culture adapts and blends rather than simply dominates. The Japanese have always been skilled at absorbing foreign influences and making them their own. In this imagined empire, the process works in reverse as well. Japanese culture itself becomes enriched and transformed by its contact with the diverse peoples under its influence. In Thailand, which allied with Japan rather than being conquered, Buddhist temples continue their ancient rituals. But now monks might also study Japanese Zen traditions, finding common ground between the Theravada and Mahayana practices. The famous Golden Buddhas of Bangkok share space with meditation gardens designed according to Japanese principles. The cultures don't replace each other, they enrich each other. Consider daily life in this alternative Korea. A businessman wakes early in Seoul, perhaps beginning his day with meditation practice according to techniques that blend Korean Buddhist traditions with Japanese methods. His breakfast might include kimchi prepared with Japanese rice, green tea imported from Uji, fish caught in waters now administered by joint Korean-Japanese fishing cooperatives. His commute to work takes him through a city that reflects multiple influences. Traditional Korean palaces have been carefully preserved and restored with Japanese assistance. New buildings employ Korean architectural motifs, but Japanese construction techniques. The streets are clean and efficient in the Japanese manner, but they pulse with Korean energy and creativity. At work, our imaginary businessman might be involved in projects that span the co-prosperity sphere. Perhaps he's coordinating the shipment of Korean steel to Indonesian shipyards, or managing the flow of Burmese rice to Japanese cities, or financing the construction of highways that will link remote Chinese provinces to the broader Asian economy. His work connects him to colleagues across the continent, all working towards shared goals of Asian development and modernization. The tea ceremony, quintessentially Japanese, spreads throughout this alternative Asia, but it takes on local characteristics wherever it travels. In Indonesia, tropical flowers are incorporated into the ceremony's aesthetic. In Burma, local teas blend with Japanese techniques to create new varieties. In the Philippines, indigenous bamboo is used to craft tea utensils that honor both Japanese tradition and Filipino craftsmanship. The impact on religion and philosophy in this alternative Asia would have been profound. Buddhism might have experienced a renaissance, flowing back toward India with renewed vigor and fresh interpretations developed through inter-Asian dialogue. Confucian principles of social harmony and respect for authority, already present in many Asian societies, could have been strengthened and systematized across the entire region. The diverse languages of Southeast Asia might have gradually given way to Japanese as the lingua franca of education, commerce, and administration. But this linguistic shift could have proceeded more gently than European colonial practices, with local languages preserved for family and cultural life, while Japanese served for broader communication. The result might have been a truly multilingual society where educated people could communicate across ethnic and national boundaries. By 1960 in this timeline, the rivers of Asia would flow past cities with Japanese names or Japanese influences. The Mekong might pass through urban centers where traditional Southeast Asian markets operate according to Japanese commercial principles. The Ganges might reflect the light from temples where Hindu and Buddhist and Shinto practices have found common ground. Technology development in this alternative Asia follows different paths than in our world. Without significant American influence, Asian innovation might have focused more on harmony between human needs and natural processes. The transistor might have been invented in Tokyo's research laboratories. Cameras and electronics might have emerged decades earlier, but designed according to aesthetic principles that prioritize beauty and integration with daily life, rather than pure functionality. The monsoon seasons still come to this alternative Asia, bringing the rain that makes rice cultivation possible across vast areas. But now, the rice moves more efficiently through Japanese-controlled transportation networks. Agricultural techniques developed in Japan's intensive farming systems are adapted to the different climates and soil conditions found across the empire. The result could be greater food security and rural prosperity than existed under previous arrangements. Trade flows in entirely different directions in this imagined world. Spices from Indonesia, silk from China, rubber from Malaysia, all move efficiently through Japanese shipping networks toward Japanese processing centers, then back out to world markets through Japanese trading companies. The Pacific Ocean becomes effectively a Japanese lake, with former American territories serving as stepping stones toward a Japanese presence on the North American coast. But imagine also the cultural exchange that might have flourished. American jazz musicians, if they existed in this timeline, might have found eager audiences in Tokyo clubs where the music would have been transformed by contact with traditional Japanese instruments and scales. Japanese haiku poets might have influenced American literature in completely different ways. The meeting of East and West could have produced entirely new forms of art that we can barely imagine. Think about the languages that might have emerged from this cultural mixing. Perhaps a pidgin form of Japanese mixed with Tagalog in the Philippines. Maybe Mandarin Chinese with Japanese grammatical structures in occupied China. English might have had less global influence, replaced by Japanese as the language of international trade throughout half the world. The educational systems of this alternative Asia might have produced a generation of truly Pan-Asian intellectuals, scholars equally at home in Tokyo, Bangkok, and Jakarta, artists who could draw inspiration from the entire range of Asian cultural traditions, scientists who could collaborate across the vast distances of the co-prosperity sphere, using shared languages and methodologies. Religious festivals in this imagined world might have become magnificent displays of Asian cultural diversity within political unity. Picture celebrations where Korean dancers perform alongside Indonesian musicians, where Japanese tea masters demonstrate their art to audiences from Burma and Vietnam, where Chinese calligraphers teach their techniques to students from across the empire. The martial arts traditions of Asia might have cross-pollinated in fascinating ways. Japanese karate might have incorporated techniques from Korean taekwondo, Chinese kung fu, Indonesian silat, and Filipino martial arts. The result could have been new synthetic fighting systems that drew on the wisdom of multiple traditions, while serving the practical needs of administration across diverse territories. Architecture in this alternative Asia might have produced buildings that we cannot even imagine in our world. Picture structures that employ Japanese principles of harmony with nature, Chinese concepts of feng shui, Indonesian techniques for dealing with tropical climates, and Korean innovations in heating and cooling. The result might have been a distinctly Asian modernism, very different from the European-influenced architecture that dominated the 20th century in our timeline. The role of women in this alternative society presents complex possibilities. Traditional Japanese concepts of women's roles might have been challenged by contact with societies where women had different status and opportunities. Indonesian matrilineal traditions, Chinese women's involvement in commerce, Filipino women's education under Spanish rule, all might have influenced the development of gender roles throughout the co-prosperity sphere. Cuisine across this imagined Asia might have evolved into fusion traditions that we can only dream about in our world. Japanese techniques applied to Indonesian ingredients. Korean fermentation methods used with Chinese vegetables. Filipino tropical fruits prepared according to Japanese aesthetic principles. The result could have been a rich flowering of culinary creativity spanning the entire Pacific region. The natural environment of Asia might have been managed according to different principles in this alternative timeline. Japanese concepts of forest management, refined over centuries on their mountainous islands, might have been applied to the rainforests of Southeast Asia. Chinese agricultural techniques might have been adapted to help feed the growing populations of the empire. Korean innovations in sustainable farming might have spread throughout the region. Music in this alternative world might have produced sounds we cannot imagine. Traditional Japanese instruments like the shamisen and koto might have been combined with Indonesian gamelan orchestras, Chinese erhus, Korean gayageums, and Filipino kulintangs. The resulting musical traditions could have been incredibly rich and varied, representing the full spectrum of Asian cultural heritage within a unified political framework. As we prepare to leave this alternative Asia, take a moment to appreciate what we've imagined together. This scenario represents not just political domination, but cultural synthesis on a scale rarely seen in human history. It suggests possibilities for unity that transcend national boundaries while preserving local traditions, for modernization that honors ancient wisdom, for power that serves cultural development rather than merely imposing control. The seasons still change in this imagined Asia, bringing their ancient rhythms to landscapes now organized according to different political principles. Spring still brings the cherry blossoms that symbolize renewal and beauty. Summer still ripens the rice that feeds millions. Autumn still paints the mountains in brilliant colors that recognize no human boundaries. Winter still covers the high places with snow that connects earth to sky. In these natural cycles lies a reminder that all human arrangements, however grand or permanent they seem, remain subject to forces larger than political power. The tides still rise and fall in this alternative Pacific. The monsoons still bring life-giving rain. The earthquakes still remind people that the earth itself has authority that no empire can challenge. Let your mind rest now from this exploration of Asian possibilities. Breathe quietly and prepare for our next journey, one that takes us to a Europe where different choices led to different outcomes, where the great ideological divide that shaped our world for 50 years never occurred, because one of the competing powers fell before it could establish its alternative vision of human organization. Chapter 4. Scenario 3. The Soviet Union defeated before 1945. Let your thoughts drift now like morning mist across the vast steppes and forests of Eastern Europe toward perhaps the most intriguing and hopeful alternative path we will explore together tonight. Imagine, with quiet contemplation and reflective curiosity, a world where the great ideological divide that defined and shaped the second half of the 20th century never fully crystallized into the Cold War confrontation that dominated international relations for nearly 50 years. Picture a Europe where the red flag never flew from Berlin to Vladivostok, where the Iron Curtain was never drawn across the continent like a scar dividing families and communities, where the nuclear standoff between competing superpowers never created the existential anxiety that characterized life during the Cold War decades for hundreds of millions of people on both sides of the ideological divide. Picture this scenario unfolding like dawn breaking slowly and peacefully over landscapes that in our historical world remained hidden behind barriers of political control, economic isolation, and mutual suspicion for nearly half a century. It is 1944 in this alternative timeline, and through some combination of military miscalculation, internal political collapse, economic exhaustion, and perhaps simple historical contingency, German forces have achieved what seemed completely impossible just months earlier. They have broken through Soviet defensive lines not in the desperate, doomed retreat that characterized the final year of war in our timeline, but in a final, unexpected offensive that catches Soviet forces unprepared, disorganized, and unable to mount effective resistance against renewed German military pressure applied at crucial strategic points. Moscow falls to advancing German units in October 1944, but this military victory proves to be both temporary and ultimately meaningless in terms of long-term political control. Stalin's communist regime, already strained far beyond normal human endurance by years of brutal warfare that cost over 20 million Soviet lives, massive industrial disruption, and internal political tensions that the war had temporarily suppressed but never resolved, collapses completely like a house built on foundations of fear and ideological coercion, rather than popular legitimacy or sustainable economic policies. The communist experiment in the world's largest country comes to an abrupt and surprising end, leaving a vast power vacuum that extends from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from the Arctic Ocean to the borders of Iran and China. This political collapse creates unprecedented opportunities for the diverse peoples of the former Soviet Union to determine their own political futures without external ideological constraints or military occupation. Yet this alternative scenario does not represent German triumph or the establishment of Nazi hegemony across Eurasia, for the German Reich itself has been exhausted and overextended far beyond its capacity to govern effectively or maintain political control over the enormous territories its armies have temporarily occupied. German military forces, spread impossibly thin across vast distances and facing hostile populations throughout occupied Europe, begin to fragment and withdraw to more defensible positions that can be sustained with available resources and personnel. The result is not the replacement of one totalitarian system with another equally oppressive alternative, but rather the simultaneous collapse of both major totalitarian powers, creating unprecedented opportunities for the peoples of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet territories to chart their own courses toward political reconstruction, economic development, and social recovery. Breathe slowly and deeply, And imagine Warsaw rising from its wartime ruins in 1947, not under Soviet military occupation and communist political control, as occurred in our historical timeline, but as a genuinely independent Polish capital freed from both Nazi and Soviet domination for the first time since 1939. The famous Old Town, systematically destroyed during the heroic but tragic 1944 Warsaw Uprising, is being painstakingly reconstructed brick by careful brick. But according to authentic Polish architectural traditions and Polish aesthetic preferences, rather than the socialist realist principles that would have been imposed by Soviet political authorities and their local communist allies. American Marshall Plan economic assistance flows eastward across traditional political boundaries that no longer represent ideological barriers, helping newly liberated nations rebuild their war-damaged economies and establish democratic political institutions according to their own cultural values and historical traditions, rather than externally imposed ideological frameworks that ignore local conditions and popular preferences. Polish craftsmen work alongside American engineers and international advisors to restore not just physical buildings and transportation infrastructure, but the social and cultural institutions that make Polish national identity meaningful and valuable to ordinary people who have suffered through years of foreign occupation and cultural suppression. The streets of this alternative Warsaw buzz with economic and cultural activity that would have been completely impossible under communist central planning and political control. Small businesses flourish as Polish entrepreneurs take advantage of newfound economic freedom to serve local consumer needs and preferences that had been ignored or actively suppressed under both Nazi occupation and communist economic planning systems. Traditional Polish cafes reopened to serve coffee imported from around the world to customers who can discuss politics, philosophy, religion, and personal dreams without constant fear of political surveillance or punishment for expressing unauthorized opinions. University facilities that had been closed or restricted during the war years reopen with curricula designed by Polish scholars and educators who are free to teach Polish history, literature, and culture according to the highest international scholarly standards rather than ideological requirements imposed by distant political authorities. Students from Western Europe and America begin arriving to study Slavic languages, Eastern European cultures, and regional history in academic settings where these subjects can be explored honestly and thoroughly, rather than being filtered through propaganda requirements and political restrictions that distort scholarly research and educational opportunities. Picture Prague in this imagined alternative timeline, perhaps the most architecturally beautiful and culturally sophisticated city in Central Europe, finally free to experience its remarkable cultural renaissance and intellectual flowering 20 years earlier than occurred in our historical world. Without the ideological censorship and artistic restrictions imposed by communist political control, Czech writers and filmmakers can explore universal themes of individual freedom, personal identity, and human potential without the political constraints that limited creative expression in our timeline, until the dramatic changes of the late 1980s. The city's ancient stone bridges spanning the Vltava River and its Gothic church spires reaching toward unchanging skies are joined by innovative new architecture that celebrates political liberation and democratic renewal, rather than serving as monuments to political repression and social control imposed by distant authorities who understood little about Czech cultural traditions or popular aspirations. Czech artists work without ideological restrictions to create artistic works that express the full range of human experience and emotion, rather than conforming to official aesthetic standards designed to support political authority and discourage individual creativity or cultural diversity that might challenge official orthodoxy. Prague's historically renowned universities attract students and faculty members from throughout Europe and North America, creating genuinely international centers of learning where intellectual ideas can be exchanged freely across traditional boundaries of nationality, language, and political ideology that had previously limited scholarly cooperation and cultural understanding. Publishing houses that had been restricted or closed during the war years begin producing books in multiple languages, translating the finest examples of Czech literature for international audiences, while making world literature available to Czech readers who had been cut off from global cultural developments by political barriers and censorship systems. The city's film studios, freed from the ideological constraints that would have been imposed by communist cultural policies, produce movies that explore universal human themes and social experiences, while drawing creative inspiration from Czech cultural traditions and contemporary European artistic movements. These films find enthusiastic audiences throughout Europe and America, contributing to international cultural understanding, while establishing Czech cinema as a distinctive and valuable artistic tradition. Budapest might well have become the intellectual and cultural capital of Eastern Europe in this alternative scenario, a magnet for artists, writers, scholars, and creative thinkers from throughout the region who are attracted by opportunities for intellectual freedom and cultural expression that would not have been available under communist rule. Hungarian mathematicians and scientists, instead of facing the choice between fleeing westward to escape political restrictions or remaining home to work under severe limitations imposed by communist ideology and central planning, can remain in Hungary to contribute to educational and research institutions that compete successfully with the finest universities and scientific establishments in Western Europe and North America. The city's magnificent Parliament building, one of the largest and most beautiful legislative structures in the world, houses an active democratic parliament again, representing genuine Hungarian political interests and popular preferences, rather than serving as a decorative facade for policies dictated by Soviet authorities who have little understanding of Hungarian history, culture, or economic needs. Hungarian political leaders engage in substantive democratic debates about economic development strategies, social policies, and international relationships, making decisions based on Hungarian national interests and popular preferences, rather than ideological requirements or strategic considerations determined in Moscow by leaders who view Eastern European countries primarily as buffer zones and sources of economic resources. The famous thermal baths that have attracted visitors to Budapest since Roman times might host international conferences bringing together intellectuals, policymakers, and business leaders from across the liberated territories to share ideas about democratic governance, market economic development, and peaceful international cooperation that honors both national sovereignty and regional collaboration. These gatherings foster the development of specifically Eastern European approaches to modern political and economic challenges, rather than simply importing solutions developed in other historical and cultural contexts that may not be appropriate for the particular circumstances and popular preferences found in this region. But what happens to Russia itself in this alternative scenario? The vast territory stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, no longer held together by communist ideology and the coercive power of the Soviet state apparatus, might fragment into smaller, more manageable political units organized around ethnic, cultural, and geographical boundaries that make administrative and economic sense for local populations. Siberia, with its enormous natural resources including oil, natural gas, precious metals, and vast forests, could develop as an independent nation or loose confederation of indigenous peoples who have finally gained meaningful control over their ancestral lands and the mineral wealth that lies beneath them. Without the extractive colonialism practiced by both Tsarist and Soviet governments, Siberian peoples might develop sustainable approaches to resource development that benefit local communities, while protecting the fragile Arctic and subarctic environments that support traditional ways of life. Ukraine achieves the independence that its people desired and fought for repeatedly throughout the 20th century, but decades earlier than occurred in our historical timeline, and without the devastating experiences of forced collectivization, artificial famines deliberately created by Soviet policies, and systematic cultural suppression that characterized communist rule throughout the Ukrainian territories. Ukrainian farmers work land that they own individually or through voluntary cooperative arrangements, making agricultural decisions based on local market conditions, traditional farming wisdom accumulated over generations, and environmental considerations rather than impossible production quotas set by distant bureaucrats who have no practical knowledge of local soil conditions, climate patterns, or agricultural techniques. Ukrainian language and culture flourish in schools and universities, where students can learn their national heritage alongside international subjects that prepare them for participation in the global economy and international cultural exchanges. Ukrainian writers and artists draw creative inspiration from rich folk traditions while engaging with contemporary international artistic movements, creating works that are both distinctly Ukrainian in their cultural roots and universally appealing in their exploration of fundamental human experiences. St. Petersburg, freed from its politically symbolic role as the birthplace of communist revolution and the site of early Bolshevik political control, might reclaim its historical position as Russia's most cosmopolitan and culturally sophisticated city. The magnificent Hermitage Museum reopens its complete art collections to international visitors and scholars, displaying artistic treasures that had been hidden, damaged, or destroyed during the chaotic revolutionary period and the subsequent decades of communist rule. The world-famous Mariinsky Theater resumes its position as one of the great opera and ballet venues, performing Russian classical works alongside new compositions by contemporary Russian artists who are free to explore their creative visions without the ideological constraints that limited artistic expression throughout the communist period. International cultural exchanges bring foreign performers, composers, and choreographers to collaborate with Russian colleagues in projects that celebrate Russian cultural achievements while fostering international understanding and artistic cooperation. The city's magnificent network of canals and Baroque architectural monuments, properly restored and maintained with assistance from international preservation experts, reflect the lights from cafes and restaurants where Russians can engage in the kind of open political and philosophical discussions that were dangerous or impossible under both Tsarist autocracy and communist totalitarianism. International cultural and educational exchanges bring foreign students, scholars, and artists to work with Russian counterparts in academic and creative projects that contribute to both Russian cultural development and international understanding of Russian history, literature, and artistic traditions. The absence of Soviet communist power creates fundamentally different dynamics in American foreign policy and international relations throughout the world. Without a competing communist superpower to balance against or contain, the United States faces completely different choices about its appropriate role in global affairs and its relationships with other nations and regions. American political leaders must decide whether to pursue global hegemony through military and economic dominance, to promote international cooperation through multilateral institutions, and shared governance arrangements, or to practice some form of strategic restraint that allows other nations and regions to develop according to their own cultural preferences and political capabilities, without American interference or control. The Marshall Plan for European Economic Reconstruction might extend all the way to Moscow and Vladivostok, with American economic assistance and technical expertise helping to establish market economic systems and democratic political institutions across the former Soviet territories. This would represent an unprecedented experiment in international cooperation and peaceful social transformation, demonstrating whether American democratic values and economic institutions can be successfully adapted to very different cultural and historical contexts. NATO might never be formed as a military alliance designed to contain Soviet expansion, or it might evolve into something quite different from the defensive organization that emerged in our historical timeline. Without the Soviet military threat to unite Western Europe and North America in common defense efforts, the Atlantic Alliance might focus more heavily on economic cooperation, cultural exchange, and coordinated approaches to global challenges that require international collaboration rather than military solutions. The atomic age unfolds along entirely different trajectories in this alternative world, without the nuclear arms race and mutual deterrence strategies that characterize the Cold War competition between American and Soviet nuclear arsenals. Instead of the dangerous nuclear standoff between superpowers that brought the world repeatedly to the brink of nuclear war, there might be a brief period of American nuclear monopoly followed by more gradual and controlled proliferation to democratic allies who share common values about the responsible use of nuclear technology. The Cuban Missile Crisis never occurs because Cuba never becomes a Soviet client state in need of nuclear protection from potential American military intervention. The Berlin airlift never happens because Berlin is never divided between competing occupation forces representing incompatible political ideologies. The Iron Curtain never falls across Europe because it is never constructed in the first place, leaving the continent free to develop as an economically and politically integrated region from the immediate post-war period. Space exploration develops with entirely different motivations and organizational structures than in our historical timeline. Instead of being driven primarily by superpower competition between American capitalism and Soviet communism, with all the nationalist rivalry and military applications that such competition encouraged, space research might be motivated primarily by scientific curiosity and genuine international cooperation from its earliest stages. Perhaps the first artificial satellite is launched through a consortium of democratic nations pooling their financial resources, technical expertise, and scientific knowledge for peaceful research purposes, rather than military and propaganda advantages. Perhaps the first human space flights are conducted by international crews representing multiple countries and cultures, rather than national heroes competing for prestige and strategic advantage. Perhaps the first human landing on the moon occurs earlier or later than in our historical timeline, but certainly with different symbolic meanings and international implications. Instead of representing victory for one political and economic system over another, space exploration might symbolize human unity and the capacity for peaceful cooperation on projects that benefit all humanity, rather than advancing narrow national interests or ideological agendas. Consider daily life in this alternative timeline through the experiences of ordinary people who suddenly have access to choices and opportunities that would have been completely unavailable under communist rule. A Ukrainian farmer in 1955 works agricultural land that he owns privately rather than as part of a collective farm imposed by communist agricultural policies that ignored local knowledge, environmental conditions, and market realities. He makes practical decisions about crop selection, planting schedules, and marketing strategies based on his own accumulated experience, traditional farming wisdom passed down through generations of his family, and current market conditions rather than bureaucratic quotas established by distant party officials who have no practical knowledge of local agricultural conditions or environmental challenges. His farmhouse, built according to traditional Ukrainian architectural styles that reflect local climate conditions, available materials, and cultural preferences, expresses his family's cultural heritage and individual choices rather than standardized designs imposed by central planning authorities who prioritized industrial efficiency over human comfort, aesthetic beauty, or cultural continuity. His children attend local schools where they learn Ukrainian language and literature, alongside international subjects that prepare them for higher education opportunities or professional careers anywhere in Europe or North America. They study Ukrainian history that celebrates national heroes and cultural achievements, rather than being forced to memorize communist interpretations of historical events that distorted or suppressed information about Ukrainian identity and aspirations. On Sundays, his family attends church services in a local parish that was never closed or converted by anti-religious campaigns, that continues to serve spiritual needs and maintain social functions that strengthen community bonds and preserve cultural traditions, connecting current generations with their ancestral heritage and religious faith. The Ukrainian countryside in this alternative timeline might be characterized by prosperous individual farms and thriving rural communities, rather than the vast collective agricultural operations that often failed to achieve their production targets while destroying traditional village life and the accumulated agricultural knowledge of centuries of successful farming. Village social life might continue to provide emotional support, cultural continuity, and mutual assistance, while adapting to modern technologies and market opportunities that improve living standards and expand economic possibilities, without destroying traditional values or community relationships that give meaning and stability to rural life. A factory worker in what might have been communist East Germany instead works in a democratically managed industrial cooperative where employees have genuine voices in workplace decisions, production planning, and profit distribution, rather than being subject to both capitalist economic exploitation and communist political control that treated workers as mere units of production, rather than human beings with legitimate interests and democratic rights. He participates in regular workplace meetings where important decisions about production methods, working conditions, and business strategies are made collectively by the people who will be most directly affected by these choices, rather than by distant managers or party officials who have little understanding of practical workplace realities or worker preferences and needs. He shares directly in company profits and productivity improvements, rather than merely receiving wages determined by bureaucratic formulas or political considerations that have little relationship to individual contributions, work quality, or business success. This gives him personal incentives to contribute creatively to workplace efficiency and product quality, while ensuring that economic benefits are shared fairly among all contributors. He can travel freely between what were once American, British, and French occupation zones, as Germany gradually reunites under democratic governance, rather than remaining permanently divided by the ideological conflict that characterized our historical timeline. His family can visit relatives throughout Germany and maintain cultural and personal relationships without requiring special permits or risking political persecution for maintaining connections across artificial political boundaries. His children attend schools where they learn German history and literature, according to honest scholarly standards, rather than either Nazi propaganda that glorified German supremacy and military conquest, or communist ideology that interpreted all historical events through the lens of class struggle and party doctrine. They study international languages and cultures that prepare them for careers in a unified Germany that participates fully in European and Atlantic political and economic institutions, rather than being isolated by ideological barriers or military confrontations that limit educational and professional opportunities. Chapter 5. Scenario 4. Another power develops the atomic bomb first. Take a slow, deep breath and prepare your mind with careful gentleness for perhaps the most chilling and psychologically challenging alternative we will explore together tonight. Let your thoughts drift carefully and deliberately toward a world where the awesome and terrible power of the atom was first unleashed, not by American hands guided by democratic values and international humanitarian law, but by others with fundamentally different motivations, different constraints on the use of ultimate force, and radically different concepts of acceptable casualties in the pursuit of political and military objectives. Imagine, with deliberate caution and contemplative restraint that acknowledges the gravity of what we are considering, that German scientists working in secret laboratories succeeded in their atomic research program before the Manhattan Project reached its successful conclusion in the deserts of New Mexico. Picture this alternative unfolding like a dark and ominous sunrise over a world that was psychologically, politically, and morally unprepared for such a terrible revelation of humanity's capacity for ultimate destruction, and the potential for human civilization itself to be ended by conscious human choices and human-designed weapons. It is December 1944 in this alternative timeline. Deep winter in the 6th year of global warfare that has already cost more human lives and caused more physical destruction than any previous conflict in recorded human history. All major combatant nations are approaching the absolute limits of their material resources, their population's physical endurance, and their society's psychological willingness to continue sacrificing for military objectives that seem increasingly uncertain and costly. Allied forces have established their precarious and hard-won foothold on the coast of Nazi-occupied France, but German resistance remains fierce, determined, and tactically sophisticated, fed by desperation and the clear knowledge that military defeat will bring foreign occupation, war crimes tribunals, and severe punishment for 6 years of aggressive warfare and systematic atrocities against civilian populations. Soviet armies press relentlessly westward from the Eastern Front, but German defenders fight with the terrible energy and fanatical determination of soldiers who understand that retreat means not just military defeat, but the likely destruction of their nation, their culture, their families, and everything they have been taught to value and protect. The war has evolved into a grinding, brutal contest of industrial production capacity, population endurance, and collective willingness to accept casualty rates that earlier generations would have considered unimaginable and morally unacceptable under any conceivable political circumstances. Then, on a cold December morning that will forever divide human history into the time before atomic weapons and the age of nuclear capability, a single German aircraft appears in the gray winter sky above London. The familiar air raid sirens do not sound their well-known warning because it is just one airplane, flying at very high altitude above the normal operational range of fighter aircraft interception, presenting no apparent threat to the great city that has already endured years of conventional bombing attacks and learned to continue functioning despite constant danger and periodic destruction. Londoners proceed with their normal morning routines, standing patiently in long queues for rationed goods, hurrying through streets still bearing visible damage from previous bombing raids, children walking to schools that continue operating despite the constant disruption and ever-present danger of wartime conditions. They have grown psychologically accustomed to the distant drone of aircraft overhead, to the periodic sounds of anti-aircraft guns firing at enemy bombers, to the persistent background anxiety that accompanies daily life in a city under military siege, but still maintaining its essential character and vital social functions. Then comes the light, more brilliant than 1,000 suns burning simultaneously, more intense than anything in previous human experience or scientific imagination, brighter than the surface of the sun itself, concentrated into a single point of ultimate energy release. In a single instant that seems to last forever in the memory of those who survive to witness it from distances great enough to avoid immediate death, the heart of London simply ceases to exist in any recognizable physical form. Westminster Abbey, where English kings and queens have been crowned in sacred ceremonies for nearly 1,000 years, where some of England's greatest poets, political leaders, and cultural heroes are buried in monuments that connect present generations to their historical heritage, disappears completely in nuclear fire that briefly achieves temperatures exceeding those found naturally anywhere in the solar system except within stars themselves. The Houses of Parliament, where democratic government evolved gradually through centuries of political struggle, constitutional development, and the slow expansion of popular representation, become individual atoms scattered on radioactive winds that will carry deadly contamination across continents and affect human health for decades to come. The Thames itself, the ancient river that has carried commercial traffic and cultural influence through the heart of London since before recorded British history began, boils and steams where nuclear fusion briefly creates conditions that exist nowhere else in nature, except during the birth and death of stars. The Tower of London, Buckingham Palace, St. Paul's Cathedral, the British Museum with its irreplaceable collections representing the cultural and artistic heritage of human civilization from around the world, all vaporize in milliseconds that obliterate centuries of accumulated human achievement, artistic creation, and cultural development. The silence that follows this unprecedented act of destruction is not merely the physical silence of a great city where millions of human voices have been permanently stilled, though that absence of familiar urban sound is profound beyond any previous experience of warfare or natural disaster. It is also the deeper psychological silence of a world that has suddenly and irrevocably glimpsed its own capacity for complete self-destruction, the terrible quiet that comes when humanity confronts the full realization that it has developed weapons capable of ending not just particular wars between particular nations, but human civilization itself. Adolf Hitler, instead of being remembered in our historical timeline as the deranged dictator who brought catastrophic destruction upon his own people and his own nation through aggressive military expansion and ideological extremism, becomes in this alternative world the political leader who first unlocked the fundamental secrets of atomic fire and demonstrated to a horrified world humanity's newly acquired power to destroy itself completely and permanently. Within days of London's nuclear annihilation, similar flashes of ultimate light illuminate the winter skies above Moscow. The ancient Kremlin, seat of Russian political power since the days of Ivan the Terrible, center of a communist empire that spans 11 time zones and governs nearly 200 million people from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, vanishes in nuclear fusion reactions that briefly create physical conditions normally found only in the hearts of stars. Red Square, where Soviet military might was displayed in carefully choreographed parades, designed to demonstrate communist strength and ideological confidence, becomes a radioactive crater where nothing will grow or live for decades, where the very soil has been transformed into poisonous material that threatens human health for generations to come. Stalin's communist regime, already strained far beyond normal human endurance by years of brutal warfare that cost over 20 million Soviet lives, massive industrial disruption, widespread civilian suffering, and internal political tensions that the war had temporarily suppressed but never actually resolved, collapses as completely and suddenly as the physical structures destroyed by atomic bombs. The communist experiment that promised to create a workers' paradise and demonstrate the superiority of socialist economic planning ends not through gradual internal reform, popular revolution, or conventional military defeat, but through atomic annihilation of the political and administrative command structure that held the vast Soviet empire together through ideological commitment, bureaucratic control, and systematic political terror. But consider carefully the ultimate complexity and inherent contradictions of this nightmarish scenario. Even with atomic weapons at their disposal as instruments of ultimate threat and destruction, could Nazi Germany realistically have maintained effective political control over a world population paralyzed by nuclear terror and motivated by intense hatred for German aggression and systematic atrocities? The fundamental practical logistics of political control and social administration remain essentially unchanged by the availability of atomic weapons. Armies must still march across territories and physically occupy cities and administrative centers. Government officials must still travel to distant regions and personally manage complex bureaucratic systems. Civilian populations must still be fed, housed, employed, educated, and provided with basic medical care and social services that make civilized life possible. Nuclear weapons provide the ultimate threat and the ultimate destructive capability, but they cannot perform the daily administrative tasks of operating complex modern societies or maintaining the intricate international economic relationships that support industrial civilization and technological development. Germany, in this alternative timeline, faces the same impossible challenges that would confront any nation attempting to govern the entire world through threats of nuclear annihilation. The weapons that provide ultimate power are simultaneously too destructive to use, except in the most extreme circumstances. Yet their political effectiveness depends entirely on maintaining credible willingness to use them repeatedly against any form of serious resistance. Perhaps atomic bombs become instruments of international intimidation and psychological warfare, rather than practical tools of territorial conquest and administrative control. German radio broadcasts transmitted throughout the world might announce with cold efficiency, "Surrender unconditionally and immediately, or your major cities will burn like London and Moscow. You have seen the consequences of continued resistance. You have 48 hours to make your choice between complete submission and total annihilation." Some national governments might comply immediately with German demands, their political leaders calculating that any form of national survival is preferable to nuclear extinction. That accommodation with German political dominance offers at least some possibility of eventual liberation, while nuclear warfare offers only death and destruction on a scale that makes recovery impossible for generations. Other peoples and nations might choose to fight even more desperately and fanatically than before, understanding that defeat in this new atomic age means not just conventional political subjugation and economic exploitation, but possible physical extermination of entire populations through weapons that make traditional concepts of military occupation, civilian protection, and post-war reconstruction completely irrelevant. Underground resistance movements might adopt different tactics when facing an enemy armed with nuclear weapons, perhaps focusing on sabotage operations designed to destroy German atomic facilities. Assassination attempts against German nuclear scientists and political leaders, or desperate efforts to acquire nuclear weapons technology that could provide some measure of deterrent capability against German atomic blackmail. Picture New York City in early 1945, its citizens scanning winter skies with new forms of existential fear that transcend anything experienced during previous wars in human history. Instead of preparing victory celebrations for the anticipated end of European fighting, Americans work frantically to prepare for the terrifying possibility that their own cities might become targets for German atomic attacks that could reduce Manhattan, Chicago, Detroit, or Los Angeles to radioactive ruins in single bombing missions. Air raid shelters that were originally designed and constructed for protection against conventional bombing attacks are hastily reinforced with lead lining, concrete barriers, and filtration systems intended to provide some measure of protection against radioactive fallout and thermal radiation. Though civil defense experts quickly realize that no practical shelter construction can provide meaningful protection against direct atomic attack by weapons that destroy everything within miles of their detonation points. Children throughout American cities learn to recognize not just the familiar sounds of approaching aircraft and traditional air raid warning sirens, but the specific warning signs of atomic weapons. The brilliant flash of light that precedes the deadly heat wave by several seconds, the electromagnetic pulse that disrupts radio communications and electrical systems, the distinctive mushroom cloud formation that marks the birth of radioactive contamination zones that will remain dangerous for decades. Schools conduct emergency evacuation drills based on the sobering assumption that atomic attacks might occur with little or no advance warning, that traditional air defense systems offer no meaningful protection against weapons that travel faster than sound and destroy entire urban areas in single explosions that exceed the destructive power of all previous human weapons combined. American families begin stockpiling food, water, medical supplies, and radiation detection equipment in basement shelters that might provide temporary protection against radioactive contamination, but offer no real security against the profound psychological trauma and social disruption of living under constant threat of atomic annihilation. The Manhattan Project takes on desperate new urgency and receives unlimited funding in this alternative timeline. But now American scientists work not to create the world's first atomic weapons, but rather to develop defensive measures against atomic attack and to achieve nuclear parity with Germany as quickly as humanly possible before German atomic superiority becomes so overwhelming that continued resistance becomes pointless and suicidal. American nuclear research focuses simultaneously on defensive countermeasures against atomic warfare and offensive capabilities that might deter further German atomic attacks through credible threats of nuclear retaliation against German cities and industrial targets. Scientists explore theoretical possibilities for intercepting atomic bombs before they reach their intended targets, for protecting urban civilian populations against radioactive contamination, and for maintaining essential government and military functions in a world where nuclear weapons make traditional concepts of national defense and homeland security completely obsolete. International relations throughout the entire world become shaped entirely and permanently by atomic terror and the psychological paralysis that accompanies the sudden realization that modern technological warfare can destroy not just military forces and industrial capacity, but entire human civilizations in timeframes measured in hours rather than years or decades. Smaller nations that previously felt protected by geographical isolation military neutrality, or alliance relationships scrambled desperately to develop their own nuclear weapons programs, understanding with crystal clarity that conventional military forces, however large or well-equipped, offer absolutely no protection against atomic attack, and that national survival in the New World Order depends entirely on nuclear deterrence capabilities. Switzerland, despite its long tradition of armed neutrality and non-involvement in European conflicts, might begin a crash program to develop atomic weapons as a matter of national survival rather than aggressive military ambition. Swiss scientists and engineers, who previously focused on precision manufacturing and pharmaceutical research, might be redirected toward nuclear physics and weapons development as the only possible defense against atomic blackmail by larger powers. Swedish researchers might abandon their traditional focus on peaceful scientific investigation to start military nuclear programs driven not by territorial ambitions or imperial dreams, but by the desperate need to avoid becoming defenseless victims of atomic warfare initiated by nations that possess nuclear weapons, while Sweden does not. Every country with sufficient scientific infrastructure, industrial capacity, and educational institutions faces the terrible choice between developing weapons of ultimate destruction that violate their moral principles and accepting permanent vulnerability to atomic attack by more technologically advanced and militarily aggressive nations. The psychological impact on daily civilian life worldwide would be immediate, profound, and permanently traumatic in ways that fundamentally alter human relationships, social institutions, and individual mental health. Imagine the psychological burden of walking down any city street anywhere in the world, knowing that familiar neighborhoods, schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions could be vaporized without warning by weapons that travel faster than sound and destroy everything within their range of effect. The constant awareness that no air raid shelter, early warning system, or civil defense preparation could provide meaningful protection against weapons that eliminate entire cities in single explosions would affect every aspect of human activity, every long-term plan for personal or professional development, every assumption about social continuity and cultural survival that makes normal life psychologically possible. Architecture and urban planning would change immediately and dramatically to reflect atomic warfare realities. Buildings might be designed according to specifications intended to withstand nuclear attack, though engineers would quickly discover that no practical civilian construction can survive direct atomic hits or protect occupants from the intense heat, radiation, and blast effects that extend for miles from nuclear detonation points. Cities might be systematically redesigned and rebuilt according to principles that assume atomic warfare as a constant possibility, with urban populations spree cuisine throughout this imagined Asia, might have evolved into sophisticated fusion traditions that we can only dream about from our current limited historical perspective. Japanese techniques for food preparation and aesthetic presentation might have been systematically applied to Indonesian ingredients and traditional spice combinations, creating dishes that honored tropical abundance while employing sophisticated preparation methods that enhanced both nutritional value and visual beauty. Korean fermentation techniques, refined over centuries of food preservation necessity, might have been combined with Chinese vegetables and Japanese rice varieties, resulting in preserved foods that supported diverse dietary needs while meeting storage requirements in different climate conditions throughout the vast empire. These fermented foods might have become staples that connected different regions through shared culinary experiences, while maintaining distinctive local characteristics. Filipino tropical fruits, abundant in varieties unknown to temperate climates, might have been prepared according to Japanese aesthetic principles, and served in social contexts that combined Spanish colonial dining customs with Asian concepts of seasonal eating and ceremonial food presentation. The result could have been dining experiences that celebrated cultural diversity while strengthening political unity and shared social identity. Thai techniques for balancing sweet, sour, salty, and spicy flavors might have been applied to ingredients from throughout the Asian region, creating regional cuisines that maintained strong local identity while incorporating innovations and specialty products from other parts of the empire. The result might have been food traditions that were both familiar to local populations and genuinely cosmopolitan in their sophistication and range of influences. The natural environment of Asia might have been managed according to fundamentally different principles in this alternative timeline, with much greater emphasis on long-term ecological sustainability and harmony between human economic activities and natural systems. Japanese concepts of forest management, developed and refined over centuries of careful resource stewardship on mountainous islands with limited natural resources, might have been adapted and applied to the vast tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia. These forest management techniques might have prevented much of the deforestation and environmental degradation that occurred in our historical timeline, maintaining biodiversity while providing sustainable yields of timber, medicinal plants, and other forest products that supported both local communities and regional economic development. Chinese agricultural techniques that emphasized soil conservation, crop rotation, and sustainable farming practices might have been systematically adapted to help feed growing urban populations while maintaining the long-term fertility and productivity of farming areas throughout the region. Traditional knowledge about maintaining agricultural sustainability over many generations might have been preserved and enhanced rather than abandoned in favor of short-term productivity maximization. Korean innovations in sustainable farming methods, developed in response to challenging mountain terrain and variable weather conditions, might have spread throughout the empire, creating agricultural systems that served immediate food production needs while protecting environmental conditions necessary for continued prosperity over many decades. Traditional Asian concepts of harmony between human society and natural systems, deeply rooted in Buddhist and Confucian philosophy, might have been strengthened and systematized rather than abandoned in favor of Western industrial approaches that often prioritized immediate economic returns over long-term environmental sustainability and social stability. Music throughout this alternative world might have produced sounds and artistic combinations that we cannot even begin to imagine from our current historical perspective. Traditional Japanese instruments like the shamisen and koto might have been creatively combined with Indonesian gamelan orchestras, Chinese erhas, Korean gayageums, and Filipino kulintangs to create musical traditions that were both incredibly rich in tonal variety and remarkably sophisticated in their cultural synthesis. New musical scales and harmonic systems might have emerged from this intensive cultural mixing, creating compositional possibilities that honored traditional aesthetic principles while exploring innovative techniques for rhythm, melody, and instrumental combination. Regional musical styles might have developed that reflected local cultural preferences, while incorporating instruments and musical techniques from throughout the empire. Folk songs and classical compositions might have been systematically translated and adapted across linguistic boundaries, creating shared repertoires of Asian music that could be performed and appreciated throughout the region, while maintaining distinct local characteristics and cultural meanings that connected contemporary audiences with their historical heritage. Contemporary composers might have drawn inspiration from the full spectrum of Asian musical traditions, creating works that synthesized classical techniques with modern themes and contemporary social experiences. The result might have been a flowering of Asian musical creativity that rivaled the great classical traditions of Europe, while serving the aesthetic and spiritual needs of modern Asian populations. As we prepare to leave this alternative Asia behind and continue our gentle journey through historical possibilities, take a moment to appreciate the remarkable scope and complexity of what we have imagined together. This scenario represents not merely the political and military domination of one Asian nation over others, but rather cultural synthesis and economic cooperation on a scale rarely achieved in human history. It suggests fascinating possibilities for political unity that transcends narrow nationalism, while preserving and enriching local cultural traditions, for economic modernization that honors ancient wisdom while serving contemporary technological and social needs, for international organization that facilitates cooperation, rather than merely imposing administrative control from distant centers of power. The seasonal rhythms still change throughout this imagined Asia, bringing their eternal natural cycles to landscapes now organized according to different political principles and cultural values than those that characterized our historical timeline. Spring still brings the cherry blossoms that symbolize renewal and natural beauty, but now they bloom in carefully tended gardens from Seoul to Singapore, from Tokyo to Jakarta, creating shared aesthetic experiences that strengthen cultural bonds across vast distances. Summer still ripens the rice that feeds hundreds of millions of people, but now the agricultural planning and harvest distribution are coordinated across continental distances to ensure adequate nutrition for all populations while maintaining sustainable farming practices that protect long-term soil fertility and water resources. Autumn still paints the mountains in brilliant colors that recognize no political boundaries, while winter still covers the northern regions of the empire with snow that connects earth and sky in timeless patterns of natural beauty that remind even the most urban populations of their connections to seasonal cycles and environmental systems. In these natural cycles lies a profound reminder that all human political arrangements, however grand or permanent they may appear, remain temporary constructions imposed upon more fundamental realities that will continue long after current political systems have been transformed or replaced by different forms of social organization. The tides still rise and fall throughout this alternative Pacific, according to lunar gravitational forces, rather than human administrative decisions. The monsoons still bring life-giving rain according to atmospheric conditions and ocean temperatures, rather than political policies or economic planning. The earthquakes still remind people throughout the region that the earth itself possesses natural authority that no human empire, however extensive or well-organized, can challenge, control, or permanently overcome. Let your mind rest now from this exploration of Asian possibilities and cultural synthesis. Breathe quietly and prepare for our next journey, one that takes us to a Europe where different historical choices and alternative political circumstances led to dramatically different outcomes, where the great ideological division that shaped our world for 50 years never fully developed because one of the competing political systems collapsed before it could establish its alternative vision of human social and economic organization. Chapter 6. Impact on Daily Life. Now, let your mind settle into quieter contemplations, like sitting by a window watching ordinary people go about their daily routines. Let's explore together how the grand political changes we've imagined might have affected the simple, intimate moments that make up most of human experience. Imagine waking up on any ordinary morning in 1960, but in one of our alternative worlds. The sun still rises, as it has for millions of years. Birds still sing their ancient songs. Your body still requires the same basic needs: food, water, warmth, rest. But the human world that surrounds you as you begin your day is profoundly different from the one we know. If you lived in Nazi-dominated Europe of our imagination, your morning routine might begin with a German-language radio broadcast. The announcer's voice, crisp and authoritative, reports production achievements in the Ruhr Valley, new settlements established in conquered territories, scientific breakthroughs that supposedly demonstrate Aryan superiority. You understand these words because German has become the language of advancement, of opportunity, of survival itself. Your breakfast might be simple but predictable. Dark bread spread with margarine, ersatz coffee made from roasted grains and chicory. Real coffee has become a luxury reserved for party members and favored collaborators. But there's a certain comfort in this routine, a reliability born of rigid social organization. The trains run precisely on schedule. Crime rates are low because dissent carries terrible risks. Everyone knows their assigned place in the hierarchy. Walking to work through streets designed according to Nazi aesthetic principles, you pass buildings that dwarf individual human beings. These massive structures, built from stone and steel, are intended to make people feel small and insignificant in comparison to state power. Yet they're also clean and well-maintained, reflecting the regime's obsession with order and control. The streets are swept clean, the public spaces carefully organized. Your work, whatever its nature, exists within the context of serving the greater German Reich. Whether you teach school or operate machinery or tend crops, your efforts contribute to a grand design that extends far beyond your individual understanding. Productivity is measured not only by output, but by ideological correctness. You've learned to say appropriate things, avoid dangerous topics, focus on immediate tasks rather than broader questions. Yet even in this most controlled environment, human relationships persist. Colleagues share quiet conversations during breaks, carefully avoiding political subjects but finding ways to express care and concern for each other. Friendships develop through shared work experiences. People fall in love despite the regime's attempts to control even intimate relationships according to racial ideology. Now shift your imagination to daily life in the Japanese-controlled Asia we explored. Your morning might begin with the sound of temple bells calling Buddhist monks to prayer, but these monks now study forms of Buddhism that blend traditional teachings with Japanese interpretations. Your breakfast consists of rice and miso soup, prepared according to techniques that combine local ingredients with Japanese culinary methods. In this alternative world, hierarchy remains important, but it's based on different principles than European fascism. Age and wisdom command respect. Social harmony is valued over individual expression. Your work becomes part of a community effort that extends across all of Asia, from the fishing villages of Japan to the rice paddies of Vietnam, from the tea plantations of Ceylon to the rubber groves of Malaysia. The pace of daily life might be different too. Japanese concepts of time and efficiency have spread throughout the region, but they've been adapted to tropical climates and monsoon seasons. Work proceeds according to natural rhythms. Intensive activity during favorable weather, rest during the heat of midday, community gathering in the cool of evening. The famous Japanese tea ceremony has evolved into dozens of regional variations throughout this imagined Asia. In Indonesia, the ceremony incorporates tropical flowers and local teas. In Burma, it adapts to indigenous concepts of hospitality and social interaction. In the Philippines, it blends with Spanish colonial traditions of formal social gathering. Each version maintains core principles of mindfulness and respect, while reflecting local cultural preferences. Picture now daily life in the liberated Eastern Europe we imagined, where Soviet communism never imposed its system of social organization. Your morning might begin with church bells that were never silenced, calling people to religious services that continued uninterrupted through the decades. Your breakfast includes foods that reflect national traditions: pierogi in Poland, goulash in Hungary, sauerkraut and sausage in Czech lands. But these traditional foods might be prepared with ingredients imported freely from around the world, creating fusion cuisines that never existed under communist restrictions. Polish pierogi might be filled with exotic spices from Asia or tropical fruits from Africa. Hungarian goulash might incorporate vegetables from the Americas. Czech beer might be brewed with hops from multiple continents. Your work in this alternative Eastern Europe might involve choices that were impossible under communist central planning. Perhaps you operate a small business selling traditional crafts to tourists from Western Europe and America. Maybe you participate in a worker-owned cooperative that makes decisions democratically, rather than according to party directives. Your children attend schools where they learn both their national language and international languages, preparing for a world where borders are open and opportunities are global. The architecture surrounding you reflects optimism rather than oppression. Buildings are designed for human comfort and aesthetic pleasure, rather than ideological intimidation. Public spaces encourage social interaction and democratic discussion, rather than surveillance and control. Parks serve as places for leisure and reflection, rather than sites for mandatory political rallies. Consider daily life in the world where nuclear weapons first appeared as instruments of destruction, rather than deterrence. Your morning routine might include checking a radiation detector, a device as common in this timeline as weather radios are in ours. Your breakfast foods are chosen not only for nutrition and taste, but for their ability to help your body process radiation exposure. Milk is tested daily for contamination. Fresh vegetables are grown in greenhouses, designed to filter radioactive particles from the air. Your workplace in this atomic world involves constant awareness of emergency procedures that go far beyond fire drills. Every building has radiation shelters, stocked with supplies for extended stays. Every radio carries special channels dedicated to atomic attack warnings. Children learn to recognize symptoms of radiation sickness alongside basic first aid techniques. Yet in any of these alternative worlds, the fundamental rhythms of human life continue. People still experience the full range of human emotions: love and anger, hope and disappointment, curiosity and boredom. Families still gather around dinner tables to share meals and conversation. Children still play games, though the specific toys and activities might reflect different cultural priorities. Romance still blooms between individuals despite political circumstances. A young German couple in Nazi-occupied France might walk along the Seine at sunset, finding beauty and intimacy despite the historical tragedy surrounding them. A Korean student in Japanese-controlled Seoul might write poetry that blends traditional Korean imagery with Japanese literary forms. A Polish family in democratic Warsaw might gather on Sundays to celebrate freedoms that previous generations could never imagine. Let your thoughts drift now to the more mundane details that fill most of daily life. Fashion in these alternative worlds would reflect different influences and priorities. In Nazi-dominated Europe, clothing styles might gradually conform to German preferences, but adapted to local climates and available materials. Traditional folk costumes might be preserved as tourist attractions, while daily wear slowly shifts toward Germanic standards. In Japanese-controlled Asia, traditional garments like the kimono might evolve into dozens of regional variations. Indonesian batik patterns could be incorporated into Japanese designs. Thai silk might be woven into obi sashes. The result could be a beautiful flowering of Asian textile arts, all developing within the framework of Japanese aesthetic principles, but enriched by contact with diverse local traditions. In liberated Eastern Europe, fashion might reflect a joyful mixture of traditional and modern, local and international influences. Polish folk embroidery might inspire haute couture designs sold in Paris and New York. Hungarian traditional costumes might influence contemporary casual wear. Czech crystal jewelry might become internationally fashionable. Music would develop along different paths in each alternative world. In Nazi Europe, jazz would be banned as degenerate music, but other forms might flourish. Perhaps German classical traditions would evolve in new directions, or folk music from across Europe would be synthesized into new forms approved by the regime. The result might be interesting, but would lack the diversity that comes from cultural freedom. In Japanese-controlled Asia, traditional instruments like the shamisen and erhu might be combined in innovative ways. Gamelan orchestras from Indonesia might incorporate Japanese instruments and scales. Thai classical music might evolve to include Japanese rhythmic patterns. The result could be a rich flowering of musical synthesis, representing the full spectrum of Asian cultural traditions. In liberated Eastern Europe, musical development might explode in all directions simultaneously. Jazz might reach Prague and Budapest by 1955, 20 years earlier than in our timeline. Rock and roll might develop European variations that blend American innovation with local folk traditions. Classical music might flourish as composers work, without political restrictions on their artistic expression. Food culture would be similarly affected by these different historical paths. In Nazi-controlled Europe, German cuisine might become dominant, but would adapt to local ingredients and preferences. French cooking techniques might persist, but would be influenced by German tastes. Italian pasta might be prepared with German sausages and sauerkraut. The results might be interesting fusion cuisines, but developed under coercion rather than free cultural exchange. In Japanese Asia, culinary influence might be more subtle and organic. Japanese principles of seasonal eating and aesthetic presentation might spread naturally throughout the region. Chinese stir-fry techniques might be applied to Japanese ingredients. Thai curries might be modified to suit Japanese preferences for subtle flavors. Sushi might evolve to include tropical fish and local vegetables from across the Pacific region. In democratic Eastern Europe, food culture might explode with creative possibilities. Polish pierogi might be filled with ingredients from around the world. Hungarian paprika might season dishes from multiple international cuisines. Czech beer might be brewed with hops and techniques borrowed from every beer-producing region on Earth. Technology and daily conveniences would develop differently in each alternative timeline. In Nazi Europe, technology might advance rapidly in areas that serve state purposes while lagging in consumer applications. Television might exist primarily as a propaganda medium. Automobiles might be efficient and well-engineered, but available only to party members and essential workers. Home appliances might be designed for durability rather than convenience. In Japanese Asia, technology might focus on miniaturization and energy efficiency. Transistor radios might be invented in Tokyo rather than America, designed to be smaller and more precise than Western alternatives. Transportation systems might be incredibly efficient, with bullet trains connecting distant cities across the continent. But innovation might be slower in areas that don't serve the collective good as defined by Japanese administrators. In liberated Eastern Europe, technology might develop through international cooperation and market competition. Scientists from Warsaw might collaborate with colleagues from Cambridge and Detroit. Engineers from Prague might work on projects funded by American venture capital. The result could be faster innovation in some areas, though perhaps less focused development without the pressure of superpower competition that drove much technological progress in our timeline. In the atomic world we imagined, technology would be heavily influenced by defense and survival needs. Radiation detection equipment would be as common as smoke detectors. Underground communication systems would be more advanced than surface networks. Medical technology would focus heavily on treating radiation exposure and genetic damage. But other areas of innovation might lag as resources are diverted to survival rather than prosperity. Transportation in these alternative worlds would reflect different priorities and possibilities. In Nazi Europe, the famous Autobahn system might extend across the continent, but travel might be restricted to approved purposes and approved people. Airlines might serve regime officials and essential workers rather than leisure travelers. International travel might be heavily controlled or prohibited entirely. In Japanese Asia, transportation might be highly efficient but organized according to hierarchical principles. Bullet trains might connect major cities, but seating arrangements might reflect social status. Airlines might serve the co-prosperity sphere, but under strict Japanese management. Ships might carry goods and passengers efficiently across the Pacific, but according to Japanese schedules and Japanese priorities. In liberated Eastern Europe, transportation might be more democratic and accessible. Airlines might connect Eastern and Western European cities for the first time since before the war. Highways might be built to international standards with international cooperation. Railways might carry goods and passengers freely across borders that were never closed by ideological conflict. Communication technologies would develop very differently in each alternative world. In Nazi Europe, radio and telephone networks might be highly developed but closely monitored. International communication might be restricted or filtered through government censors. Television might be sophisticated technically, but limited to approved programming that serves state ideology. In Japanese Asia, communication might be efficient but organized according to collective rather than individual needs. Telephone systems might prioritize official and commercial communication over personal use. Radio broadcasts might carry approved programming in multiple languages, but with unified political messages. International communication might be possible, but channeled through Japanese administrative systems. In democratic Eastern Europe, communication might flourish without the restrictions that existed in our timeline. Telephone calls between East and West might be routine rather than dangerous. Radio broadcasts might carry diverse programming from multiple countries. International mail might flow freely without censorship or delay. Shopping and commerce would function according to different principles in each alternative world. In Nazi Europe, retail might be highly organized but limited in choice. Stores might carry goods that meet official standards for quality and ideological appropriateness. Luxury items might be available only to party members, while ordinary citizens make do with standardized products designed for efficiency rather than variety. In Japanese Asia, commerce might blend traditional market practices with modern efficiency. Local markets might continue to operate according to ancient customs, but within Japanese administrative frameworks. International trade might be highly organized and efficient, but directed toward Japanese priorities rather than free market forces. In liberated Eastern Europe, retail might combine the best of traditional and modern approaches. Local crafts might be sold alongside international products. Markets might operate according to democratic principles, with minimal government interference. Shopping might be both a commercial and social activity, reflecting the freedom to choose from diverse alternatives. Recreation and entertainment would certainly be affected by these different historical paths. In Nazi Europe, leisure activities might be organized according to state objectives. Sports might emphasize physical fitness for military service rather than individual enjoyment. Entertainment might be designed to reinforce official values rather than provide escape or challenge prevailing ideas. In Japanese Asia, recreation might reflect traditional values of social harmony and personal cultivation. Martial arts might be widely practiced not only for physical fitness, but for character development. Traditional arts like calligraphy and flower arrangement might be taught alongside modern recreational activities. Entertainment might emphasize group participation rather than individual stardom. In democratic Eastern Europe, recreation might flourish with unprecedented freedom and diversity. Sports leagues might include teams from across the continent without ideological restrictions. Entertainment might draw from both Eastern and Western traditions to create new forms of cultural expression. Tourism might develop early as people travel freely to explore their liberated continent. Family life would be influenced but not determined by these different political systems. Parents would still love their children and work to provide them with better opportunities. Children would still learn from their elders while gradually developing their own identities and ambitions. Family celebrations would still mark the passage of time and the continuation of generations, though the specific customs and expectations might vary. In any of these alternative worlds, the changing seasons would still mark the passage of time with the same natural rhythms that have shaped human life for millennia. Spring would still bring renewal and hope. Summer would still provide abundance and energy. Autumn would still offer harvest and preparation. Winter would still require endurance and faith in future warmth. These natural cycles would remind people in any political system that human arrangements, however permanent they seem, remain subject to forces larger than political power. The tides would still rise and fall according to lunar gravity rather than human authority. The rains would still come according to atmospheric conditions rather than ideological requirements. The stars would still shine according to cosmic forces that recognize no earthly empires. As we prepare to leave this intimate exploration of alternative daily life, take a moment to appreciate what remains constant across all possible timelines. Human needs for food, shelter, safety, love, meaning, and beauty persist regardless of political circumstances. The capacity for kindness, creativity, courage, and hope survives even the most oppressive conditions. The bonds between family members, friends, and communities prove stronger than the systems that try to control them. Let your mind rest now in this understanding that the essential qualities of human life transcend the particular arrangements that societies create to organize themselves. Breathe quietly and prepare for our final comparison, where we'll consider how these imagined alternatives help us appreciate the world we actually inherited from the choices made by previous generations. Chapter 7. Comparison with our reality. Breathe deeply now and let your mind return gently to the world we know, the timeline we actually inhabit. After journeying through these alternative possibilities, we can appreciate with fresh eyes the particular path that history actually took after 1945. Like returning home after a long journey, familiar sights take on new meaning when seen with expanded perspective. In our world, the Allied victory created not a simple triumph of good over evil, but a complex new set of challenges and opportunities. The United States and Soviet Union, united in their opposition to fascism, quickly found themselves divided by competing visions of how human society should be organized. This division, which we came to know as the Cold War, shaped global politics for nearly half a century. Yet this ideological competition, tense and dangerous as it often became, created a kind of balance that may have prevented even larger conflicts. Neither superpower could act without considering the other's response. This mutual constraint, born of nuclear fear and ideological competition, forced both sides to pursue their goals through diplomacy, economic competition, and proxy conflicts rather than direct confrontation between major powers. The United Nations emerged from the war as humanity's first truly global institution, flawed and often ineffective, but providing a forum where nations could resolve disputes through dialogue rather than warfare. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights established principles that, while frequently violated, became international standards against which all governments could be measured and criticized. Consider how European integration proceeded in our timeline, compared to the alternatives we've imagined. The European Coal and Steel Community, founded in 1951, brought together France and Germany as partners rather than enemies for the first time in centuries. This economic cooperation gradually expanded into the European Economic Community and eventually the European Union, demonstrating that even the deepest historical antagonisms could be overcome through patient institution building. The Marshall Plan represents one of the most generous acts in international relations, as the United States chose to rebuild its former enemies rather than exploit their defeat. Germany and Japan, the principal Axis powers, were transformed from conquered territories into democratic allies and eventually into prosperous partners in the international system. This precedent of turning former adversaries into friends established a model that continues to influence international relations. Decolonization proceeded in our timeline through a complex process that was often messy and sometimes violent, but which ultimately saw the great empires of the 19th century give way to independent nations across Africa and Asia. While Cold War rivalries complicated many of these transitions, the principle of self-determination that the Allied victory established as a fundamental value gradually extended to peoples around the world. Technology advanced at unprecedented rates in our post-war world. The same scientific knowledge that created atomic weapons also led to peaceful nuclear energy, medical isotopes that save lives, and space exploration that expanded human understanding of our place in the cosmos. The computer revolution, driven partly by military needs, but enabled by free inquiry and market competition, eventually transformed human communication and commerce in ways that seemed like science fiction in 1945. The prosperity that emerged in the developed world after 1945, while unevenly distributed and sometimes environmentally costly, was unprecedented in human history. Living standards rose dramatically across North America, Europe, and Japan. Education became more accessible to larger numbers of people. Medical advances extended human lifespans and reduced infant mortality. Social safety nets developed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. Women entered the workforce in larger numbers and began the long struggle for political and social equality. The civil rights movement in America eventually achieved legal equality for all citizens, regardless of race, establishing principles that influenced liberation movements around the world. These social changes, while incomplete and ongoing, represented fundamental shifts toward greater human dignity and opportunity. The environmental movement emerged as humans began to understand that industrial progress carried ecological costs. The same scientific methods that had won the war were applied to understanding climate, pollution, and conservation. While environmental problems persist and have even intensified, the awareness of humanity's impact on the planet represents a crucial development in human consciousness. International law evolved to address crimes against humanity, establishing the principle that some actions are so terrible that they concern all people, not just the nations where they occur. The Nuremberg trials set precedents that eventually led to international criminal courts and a growing body of jurisprudence governing human rights and humanitarian intervention. But our timeline also included persistent problems and failures. The Cold War created its own casualties through proxy conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. These wars devastated local populations even as they served the strategic interests of distant superpowers. The nuclear arms race created an ongoing threat of accidental or intentional destruction that persists to this day. Economic inequality continued both within and between nations despite overall growth in prosperity. The wealth of the developed world often came at the expense of developing countries that provided raw materials and cheap labor, but saw little benefit from global economic expansion. Racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination persisted despite legal progress toward equality. Environmental degradation accelerated as industrial prosperity spread around the world. The same processes that created wealth also produced pollution, climate change, and resource depletion. The challenge of balancing human needs with ecological limits remains largely unresolved as we move deeper into the 21st century. Yet, when we compare our imperfect reality with any of the alternatives we've imagined tonight, the world we inherited begins to look remarkably fortunate. Consider the institutions that emerged from 1945. Imperfect but genuine attempts to organize human affairs according to principles of democracy, human rights, and international cooperation. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, whatever its limitations, helped prevent the kind of total war that devastated the first half of the 20th century. The European Union made war between France and Germany not just unlikely but practically unthinkable. The United Nations, despite its frequent paralysis and ineffectiveness, provided a forum for dialogue when dialogue seemed impossible. The values established during and after the war, particularly the commitment to democracy, human rights, and rule of law, spread gradually but persistently around the world. Countries that were dictatorships in 1945 evolved into democracies over subsequent decades. Peoples who were colonies achieved independence and self-governance. Rights that were available only to privileged minorities were gradually extended to larger portions of humanity. Technology developed in our timeline connected the world in ways that would have seemed magical to someone living in 1945. The Internet allows instant communication across continents and cultures. Medical advances have eliminated diseases that once killed millions. Space exploration revealed the beauty and fragility of our planet, as seen from the cosmos, fundamentally changing human perspectives about our place in the universe. Arts and culture flourished in ways that might not have been possible under more restrictive alternatives. Jazz music, which was banned in Nazi Germany, found audiences worldwide and influenced musical development in every culture it touched. Hollywood movies, prohibited in communist countries, eventually reached global audiences and created shared cultural references across national boundaries. Literature, painting, music, and film were enriched by contributions from every continent and culture. The free flow of ideas and artistic expression, while never complete or perfect, allowed for cross-cultural fertilization that produced innovations and beauty impossible under more controlled systems. The Renaissance that began in Europe centuries ago became truly global in the post-war era. Scientific collaboration accelerated human understanding of everything from subatomic particles to cosmic structures. International cooperation in research, which seemed impossible during the war, became routine in universities and laboratories around the world. Scientists shared data, techniques, and discoveries across national boundaries that once seemed insurmountable. The Green Revolution increased agricultural productivity enough to feed growing global populations. Medical research conquered diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. Transportation technology made global travel accessible to ordinary people, rather than just the wealthy elite. Communication technology connected families, communities, and cultures across vast distances. Take a moment to consider the simple but profound fact that you can listen to these words in complete freedom, can agree or disagree with them without fear of consequences, can discuss them with others who hold different views without risking punishment. This freedom of thought and expression, which we sometimes take for granted, was precisely what was at stake in the conflicts we've been imagining. The world of 2025, for all its serious problems, offers opportunities that would have seemed miraculous to someone living in 1945. People can travel from one continent to another in hours rather than weeks. Information that once required access to great libraries is available instantly to anyone with internet access. Diseases that once meant certain death can be cured with pills or simple procedures. More importantly, the values that emerged from victory over fascism have become, however imperfectly implemented, the aspirational standards for human civilization. When governments fail to protect human rights, they face criticism not because their critics have superior power, but because the standards themselves have gained legitimacy and acceptance around the world. When nations violate international law, they encounter consequences not because they are weak, but because the law itself has developed authority and institutional support. When leaders abuse their power, they face opposition not just from political rivals, but from civil society institutions that have grown stronger over the decades since 1945. The children growing up in our world face serious challenges: climate change, economic inequality, the persistent threat of nuclear weapons, the disruptions that come with rapid technological change. But they face these challenges in a world that has established institutions for addressing problems cooperatively, values that prioritize human dignity, and technologies that make solutions possible even when they don't make them easy. Democracy, while imperfect and sometimes frustrating, provides mechanisms for peaceful change that were unavailable to previous generations. Human rights law, while often violated, provides standards and institutions that allow oppressed peoples to seek justice. International organizations, while bureaucratic and sometimes ineffective, provide alternatives to warfare for resolving disputes. The environmental movement, while facing enormous challenges, has raised global awareness about humanity's impact on the planet and has begun to develop technologies and policies for sustainable development. The women's rights movement has challenged ancient assumptions about human potential and continues to expand opportunities for half of humanity. The civil rights movement demonstrated that deeply entrenched systems of oppression could be changed through sustained moral and political pressure. The success of this movement inspired similar efforts around the world, showing that progress toward justice, while slow and difficult, remains possible even against seemingly impossible odds. Consider how the Marshall Plan established a precedent for international cooperation in reconstruction, rather than exploitation of defeated enemies. This generous approach to post-war recovery helped create the prosperous democratic allies that became America's partners in building the international system we know today. The Bretton Woods system, whatever its flaws, created international economic institutions that facilitated unprecedented global prosperity. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade evolved into the World Trade Organization, creating rules for international commerce that, while imperfect, provided alternatives to the economic nationalism that contributed to both world wars. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, established principles that have gradually gained acceptance around the world. While these rights are often violated, The Declaration provides standards that allow advocates to challenge oppression and work toward greater human freedom and dignity. International humanitarian law evolved through the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, establishing rules for warfare that, while not always observed, provide legal frameworks for protecting civilians and prisoners during armed conflicts. These laws represent humanity's attempt to maintain moral limits even in the extremity of war. The Nuremberg Principles establish that individuals, including government leaders, can be held accountable for crimes against humanity. This precedent has evolved into international criminal courts that prosecute war crimes and genocide, demonstrating that no one is above the law when it comes to the most serious violations of human rights. The development of international refugee law provided protection for people fleeing persecution and violence. While refugee protection remains inadequate in many situations, the legal frameworks and international institutions created after 1945 have saved millions of lives and provided new starts for displaced peoples. Decolonization, while often messy and incomplete, established the principle that peoples have the right to self-determination. This principle has been applied not only to former colonies, but to peoples seeking independence or autonomy within existing states, creating new possibilities for political organization based on consent rather than force. The growth of international non-governmental organizations provided new ways for people to organize across national boundaries to address common problems. Organizations working on human rights, environmental protection, humanitarian assistance, and development have created networks of cooperation that supplement and sometimes substitute for government action. The information revolution that began with computers and culminated with the Internet has made knowledge and communication accessible to ordinary people in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1945. This democratization of information has empowered individuals and communities to organize, learn, and advocate for their interests in unprecedented ways. Medical advances have not only extended human lifespans, but have improved the quality of life for millions of people. Diseases that once condemned people to suffering and early death have been conquered or controlled. Surgical techniques that seemed impossible in 1945 have become routine procedures that restore health and function. Educational opportunities have expanded dramatically since 1945, with literacy rates rising around the world and higher education becoming accessible to much larger portions of the population. This expansion of education has created human capital that drives innovation and economic growth, while also fostering democratic participation and cultural development. The gradual extension of political rights to previously excluded groups has made democratic governments more representative and responsive. Women's suffrage, civil rights for minorities, and the lowering of voting ages have broadened political participation and made democracy more inclusive and legitimate. Labor movements and social legislation have improved working conditions and provided social safety nets that protect people from the worst effects of economic disruption. While economic inequality remains a serious problem, the combination of labor rights, social insurance, and progressive taxation has created more humane forms of capitalism than existed before 1945. The environmental movement has raised awareness about humanity's impact on the natural world and has begun to develop technologies and policies for sustainable development. While environmental challenges remain daunting, the scientific understanding and institutional frameworks for addressing them represent significant advances over previous eras when environmental costs were ignored entirely. International scientific cooperation has accelerated the pace of discovery and innovation. Projects like the Human Genome Project, international space stations, and global climate research demonstrate that humanity can work together to expand knowledge and address common challenges when political barriers are overcome. Cultural exchange through travel, communication, and trade has created unprecedented opportunities for people to learn from different traditions and ways of life. This cultural mixing has produced new forms of art, music, literature, and cuisine that enrich human experience and promote understanding across traditional boundaries. The growth of international law has created frameworks for resolving disputes peacefully and holding governments accountable for their treatment of their own people. While international law is often weak and inconsistently enforced, its gradual development represents humanity's attempt to govern itself according to agreed principles rather than mere force. As you consider these developments, remember that none of them was inevitable. Each represented choices made by human beings who could have chosen differently. The democratic institutions that protect us, the human rights that we claim, the prosperity that many enjoy, all of these emerged from specific decisions by specific people at specific moments in history. The generation that fought World War II and built the post-war order faced choices between revenge and reconciliation, between nationalism and internationalism, between fear and hope. Their choices, while imperfect, generally moved in the direction of expanding human freedom, dignity, and opportunity. They chose to build institutions rather than simply enjoy victory. This understanding should inspire both gratitude and responsibility. Gratitude for the choices made by previous generations that created the world we inherited. Responsibility to make choices ourselves that will give future generations a world worthy of their inheritance and their dreams. The institutions that protect our freedoms, the prosperity that supports our families, the knowledge that expands our understanding, none of these things maintain themselves. They require constant attention, constant renewal, constant defense by people who understand their value and are willing to work to preserve and improve them. Democracy must be practiced daily by citizens who participate in the political process, who hold their leaders accountable, who engage with their communities to address common problems. Human rights must be defended by people who speak up when they witness injustice, who support organizations working to protect the vulnerable, who refuse to accept oppression as inevitable. International cooperation must be sustained by leaders who remember that the alternative to cooperation is often conflict, by citizens who understand that their welfare is connected to the welfare of people in other countries, by institutions that provide alternatives to nationalism and unilateralism. The scientific and technological progress that has improved human life must be guided by ethical considerations that ensure benefits are shared broadly and risks are managed responsibly. The environmental challenges that threaten our planet require international cooperation and individual responsibility on an unprecedented scale. But as we've seen in our exploration tonight, human beings have demonstrated repeatedly that they can rise to meet extraordinary challenges when they understand what's at stake and when they have institutions and values that enable cooperation rather than conflict. The victory over fascism was achieved not by superheroes or saints, but by ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The farmers who fed armies, the workers who built weapons, the nurses who tended the wounded, the teachers who maintained hope for the future. All of these ordinary people contributed to outcomes that seemed impossible at the beginning and inevitable only in retrospect. We are the inheritors of their victory and the beneficiaries of their choices, but we are also responsible for our own choices and our own legacy. The world we pass on to the next generation will reflect our decisions about cooperation or conflict, inclusion or exclusion, hope or fear, the kind of future we want to help create. Take a moment now to breathe deeply and appreciate the particular moment in history you inhabit. You live in an era of unprecedented freedom, prosperity, and opportunity. You have access to knowledge, technologies, and experiences that would have seemed magical to previous generations. You are part of a global civilization that, for all its problems, has achieved things that were only dreams in 1945. But you also live at a time when the choices you make, individually and collectively, will determine whether this progress continues or whether humanity retreats into darker alternatives. The same capacity for wisdom and folly, for cooperation and conflict, for creation and destruction that existed in previous generations exists in our generation as well. The difference is that we have the advantage of their experience, their mistakes to learn from, their successes to build upon. We have institutions they created to help us address collective challenges. We have technologies they could barely imagine to help us communicate, cooperate, and create solutions to common problems. Most importantly, we have their example of how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they understand what's at stake and when they are willing to work together toward common goals. Chapter 8. Closing Reflection. Now, as our gentle journey through alternative histories draws toward its close, let your mind settle like evening mist over a quiet landscape. We've traveled together through worlds that never were, exploring possibilities that existed only in the realm of imagination, yet which feel real enough to help us appreciate the world that actually emerged from the choices made by previous generations. The question that began our exploration was simple. What if World War II had ended differently? But as we've discovered together, this question opens onto vast territories of human possibility, reminding us that history is not a story that happens to us, but a story that we participate in writing through our daily choices and actions. We've imagined Nazi triumph spreading German culture and ideology across Europe through force and intimidation. We've pictured Japanese vision of Asian unity, creating a co-prosperity sphere that might have been beautiful in some ways, but built on conquest and cultural domination. We've explored a world where Soviet communism collapsed early, leaving Eastern Europe free to choose democratic development. We've considered the horror of atomic weapons first deployed not as deterrents, but as instruments of conquest and terror. In each alternative timeline, we've seen how grand political changes would have affected the intimate details of daily life. What people ate for breakfast, what languages children learned in school, what music played on the radio, what fears shaped their dreams and aspirations. We've observed how human nature persists across all possible circumstances, how people find ways to love, create hope, and maintain dignity even under the most challenging conditions. We've compared these imagined alternatives with the complex reality we actually inherited, recognizing both the achievements and the failures of the post-war world. We've seen how institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union, while imperfect, provided frameworks for cooperation that helped prevent the total wars that devastated earlier generations. Perhaps most importantly, we've recognized that none of these outcomes, either the alternatives we imagined or the reality we inherited, was inevitable. History emerges from human choices, and human choices always contain the possibility of different outcomes. The same capacity for wisdom and foolishness, for cooperation and conflict, that shaped the past continues to shape the present and will determine the future. This understanding carries both comfort and responsibility. Comfort, because it reminds us that even the darkest periods in human history eventually pass, that human creativity and resilience eventually find ways to build something better from the ruins of failed systems. Responsibility, because it reminds us that our own choices matter, that we are not passive observers of historical forces but active participants in creating the world our children will inherit. The generation that fought World War II faced what seemed like impossible odds against forces that threatened to destroy everything they valued about human civilization. Yet they found ways to cooperate across national, cultural, and ideological boundaries to defeat these threats and build institutions that have served humanity for 8 decades. Their victory was not achieved through superhuman abilities or divine intervention, but through the accumulated effect of millions of ordinary people making extraordinary choices. The factory worker who stayed late to complete an order for military equipment, the farmer who grew food despite shortages and rationing, the nurse who comforted wounded soldiers far from home, the teacher who maintained hope for peace while preparing children for war. Each of these individual acts contributed to an outcome that seemed impossible when the war began. We face different challenges today, but challenges that are no less serious and no less requiring of cooperation, sacrifice, and sustained commitment. Climate change threatens the planet that sustains all human life. Nuclear weapons remain capable of destroying civilization in hours or minutes. Economic inequality creates tensions that threaten democratic institutions. Authoritarian movements challenge the values of human rights and rule of law that emerged from the Allied victory. But we also have advantages that the World War II generation lacked. We have their experience to learn from, their institutions to build upon, their example to inspire us. We have technologies that enable cooperation and communication across vast distances and cultural differences. We have scientific understanding that reveals both the challenges we face and potential solutions to address them. Most importantly, we have evidence that human beings can rise to meet existential challenges when they understand what's at stake, and when they have values and institutions that enable cooperation rather than conflict. The victory over fascism proved that democracy, despite its messiness and inefficiency, can mobilize people more effectively than tyranny. The Marshall Plan proved that former enemies can become friends when they're treated with respect and offered genuine partnership. The Civil Rights Movement proved that deeply entrenched systems of oppression can be changed through sustained moral and political pressure. The environmental movement has begun to prove that human beings can change their behavior when they understand the consequences of continuing current practices. Each of these examples demonstrates that progress, while never easy or guaranteed, remains possible when enough people commit themselves to working for it. The alternatives we've explored tonight remind us what we might have lost if previous generations had made different choices or faced different circumstances. The world without the Marshall Plan, without the United Nations, without the gradual extension of human rights to previously excluded peoples, would have been darker, more dangerous, less hopeful than the world we actually inhabit. But our exploration also reminds us that the progress we've achieved is not permanent or guaranteed. The same forces that created fascism in the 1930s, extreme nationalism, economic disruption, scapegoating of minority groups, the appeal of simple answers to complex problems, remain present in human societies. Vigilance and active commitment to democratic values remain necessary to prevent regression toward darker alternatives. The institutions that protect our freedoms were created by people who understood their value and were willing to work to establish them. These institutions will be preserved only by people who understand their value and are willing to work to maintain them. Democracy is not an inheritance we receive automatically, but a practice we must engage in daily. Human rights are not guarantees provided by governments, but standards we must insist upon and defend. International cooperation is not a natural state of affairs, but an achievement that must be constantly renewed through the patient work of diplomacy, trade, cultural exchange, and shared commitment to common values. The prosperity we enjoy was created by people who were willing to invest in education, infrastructure, research, and institutions that would benefit future generations even when the immediate benefits were uncertain. Our prosperity will be sustained only if we make similar investments in the future, even when the costs seem high and the benefits seem distant. The scientific and technological progress that has improved human life emerged from societies that valued inquiry, innovation, and the free exchange of ideas. Continued progress requires continued commitment to these values, even when scientific findings challenge comfortable beliefs or technological changes disrupt established ways of life. As you prepare to return from this journey through alternative histories, carry with you the understanding that you are part of a continuing story, a narrative of human struggle and achievement that began long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. Your part in this story, however small it may seem, matters more than you might imagine. The choices you make about how to treat other people, how to participate in your community, how to respond to injustice and suffering, how to care for the environment, how to raise your children, how to vote, how to spend your money, how to use your talents, all of these choices contribute to the direction of human civilization. You may never make decisions that affect millions of people or shape the course of nations, but the cumulative effect of billions of individual choices by ordinary people, like yourself, determines whether humanity moves toward greater freedom, justice, prosperity, and sustainability, or toward their opposites. The generation that defeated fascism was not composed primarily of famous leaders whose names we remember, but of ordinary people whose names are forgotten, but whose choices made the victory possible. Similarly, the challenges we face today will be met not primarily by famous leaders, but by ordinary people like yourself who choose to act responsibly and courageously when the circumstances require it. History is made by people who care enough to pay attention to what's happening around them, who understand that their individual actions connect to larger patterns and consequences, who are willing to make sacrifices for principles and values that extend beyond their immediate self-interest. The world you wake up to tomorrow is the same world we've explored tonight, imperfect but full of possibility, shaped by previous choices but not bound by them, facing serious challenges but not without resources to meet them. It's a world where the values of human dignity, democracy, and cooperation have proven their worth, even if they haven't achieved their full realization. It's also a world where your choices matter, where your voice can be heard, where your actions can contribute to outcomes that seem impossible today, but might become inevitable through the accumulated effect of millions of people choosing to work toward common goals. The story continues, and you are part of it. The same creativity, courage, and commitment that enabled previous generations to build the world you inherited remain available to help you improve the world you will pass on to future generations. Rest now in this knowledge. Dream of the world you want to help create. Wake tomorrow ready to make the small daily choices that, multiplied across billions of people over many years, will determine whether the human story continues to move toward greater wisdom, justice, and compassion, or turns toward darker alternatives that remain possible but need not become reality. The greatest lesson from our exploration tonight is not what could have happened in the past, but what can still happen in the future. The same human capacities that shaped history remain available to shape what comes next. The choice, as always, is ours. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you are connected to the great human adventure, that your life has meaning and purpose within the larger story of our species, struggle to create societies worthy of our highest aspirations and deepest values. Tomorrow is another day to participate in writing history, to choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over ignorance, hope over fear, love over hatred. The possibilities remain as unlimited as human imagination, and as real as human commitment to turning possibility into reality. The story continues, and you are part of it. Sweet dreams.